there. You the fan. Welcome back to our podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of cultures, traditions, and everyday life. I'm Mira, and I'm super to be here today with my co-host, the one and only Leah.
What's up, everyone? I'm Leo, and I'm thrilled to be back with Mira for another episode. We've got a fantastic topic lined up for you today. So, grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started.
You know, Leo, I have to share a funny story with you all before we begin. So, the other day, I was trying to cook a simple meal, but things took a turn for the worse. I managed to set the kitchen on fire, and the fire alarm went off. I was like, who needs a romantic dinner when you can have a fire grill?
Oh man, Mira, that's hilarious. I'm glad you're okay. Though, I've had my fair share of kitchen disasters too. But hey, at least you got a good story out of it. Speaking of stories, I had a similar experience with my coffee machine. I was trying to make a cup of coffee, but it ended up spraying coffee all over the room. I was like, well, I guess I'll just have to wear this as a coffee-themed t-shirt now.
Oh my god, that's so funny. I'm glad we can both laugh about our mishaps. But enough about us. Let's talk about today's topic. We're going to be comparing two amazing countries, Lesotho and Senegal. Which one would you choose? Leo?
Great question. Mira, I think both countries have their own unique charm. But if I had to choose, I'd say Lesotho. I mean, who wouldn't want to visit a country with a beautiful landscape and a rich cultural heritage? Plus, the people are super friendly and welcoming. But, of course, Senegal has its own advantages too. The food, the music, the culture. It's all so vibrant and exciting.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore today. We'll be talking about everything from the economy and politics to the culture and traditions of both countries. We'll answer all the questions that are on your mind, whether you're planning a trip, of moving there, or even considering marrying someone from one of these countries.
Well, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the comprehensive guide we'll be providing today. And, of course, we're proud to be brought to you by Jetoff. The platform that's all about helping you explore new cultures and experiences. Thanks, Jetoff AI, for your support.
Yes, and we're to share our knowledge with you all. So, without further ado, let's dive into our comparison of Lesotho and Senegal. Stay tuned. Everyone, it's going to be a wild ride.
That's right, Mira. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, so you can stay up to date with all our latest episodes. We'll be back after this short break, so stick around. Boom.
And don't worry, Leo, I won't let you get too carried away with your coffee machine stories.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, Mira. But anyway, let's get back to our topic. Lesotho and Senegal. Here we come. Well,
So let's dive into the numbers and see how Lesotho and Senegal stack up when it comes to general safety and crime rates. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to Lesotho?
actually, I haven't. But I've heard it's a beautiful country with stunning landscapes. What draws you to Lesotho, Mira?
Well, I've been reading about the unique approach to community policing, and I think it's really interesting. They have a strong focus on neighborhood watch programs and community engagement.
That's great to hear. Senegal, on the other hand, has a more traditional approach to policing. They have a well-organized police force, but they also struggle with corruption and resource allocation.
I see. And what about crime rates in Lesotho? I've heard they're relatively high compared to other countries in the region.
Yes, that's true. Lesotho has a high crime rate, particularly when it comes to property crimes like burglary and theft. But, as you mentioned, they're also working on community-based initiatives to address these issues.
I'm curious. Leah, do you think that community-based policing could be a model for other countries to follow?
Absolutely. I think it's a great way to build trust between law enforcement and the community, and it can be an effective way to reduce crime rates.
That's a great point. And what about Senegal? Have they implemented any similar community-based initiatives?
Actually, yes. Senegal has a program called community policing that aims to build partnerships between the police and the community. It's a relatively new initiative, but it shows promise.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think community-based policing is the way forward for Lesotho and Senegal?
I think it's definitely worth exploring further. And I'm curious. Mira, have you ever experienced any safety concerns while traveling in Africa?
Well, I've had my share of close calls, but I think that's just part of traveling in any new place. But I do think that understanding the local culture and customs can go a long way in terms of feeling safe.
That's a great point. And what about our listeners? Have any of you had any close calls while traveling in Africa?
I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's always better to be prepared and do your research before traveling to a new country.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially true when it comes to safety and crime. It's always better to err on the side of caution.
Well, let's take a look at some of the statistics for Lesotho and Senegal. According to the World Bank, Lesotho has a crime rate of 30.6 per 100. 0 people, while Senegal has a crime rate of 12.6 per 100. 0 people.
That's a significant difference. Mira, but what do you think is behind these numbers? Is it just a matter of crime rates? Or are there other factors at play?
I think there are definitely other factors at play. For example, Lesotho has a relatively high poverty rate, which can contribute to crime.
That's a good point. And what about Senegal? Do you think their lower crime rate is due to their more organized police force?
Actually, I think it's more complex than that. Senegal has a strong cultural emphasis on community and social cohesion, which can help to reduce crime rates.
That's a great point. And I think that's something that Lesotho could learn from. Maybe they could implement some of Senegal's community-based initiatives to address their high crime rate.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Lesotho could benefit from some of Senegal's community-based initiatives?
I think it's definitely worth exploring further. And I'm curious, Mira, have you ever been to a country with a high crime rate and felt safe anyway?
Well, I've been to countries with high crime rates, but I've also been to countries with low crime rates. And I think it's all about attitude and being aware of your surroundings.
That's a great point. And what about our listeners? Have any of you ever felt safe in a country with a high crime rate?
I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's always better to be prepared and do your research before traveling to a new country.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially true when it comes to safety and crime. It's always better to err on the side of caution.
Well, let's wrap up this topic for now. I'm curious. Do you think that community-based policing is the key to reducing crime rates in Lesotho and Senegal?
I think it's definitely worth exploring further. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners would say about this topic?
I think our listeners would agree that it's always better to be prepared and do your research before traveling to a new country.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially true when it comes to safety and crime. It's always better to err on the side of caution.
Tom, let's dive into the fascinating world of Lesotho and Senegal. 2 countries with unique approaches to governance and community relations. I'm curious. Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Lesotho's political system?
That's a great question. Mira, Lesotho has a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system, which is quite interesting. I've heard that the king has a significant role in the government, but it's not as influential as you might think.
That's right. Leah, the king's role is largely ceremonial, but it's still an important symbol of national identity. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the king's involvement in the government. Leo, what do you think about the concept of a constitutional monarchy in Lesotho?
Well, it's an interesting system, but it's not without its challenges. I've read that Lesotho has had its fair share of political instability in the past, with several coups and power struggles. It's a complex issue, but I'm sure our listeners would agree that a stable government is essential for any country.
Absolutely. Yeah, stability is key. And Lesotho has made significant progress in recent years. But what about Senegal? How does its government compare to Lesotho's?
Senegal has a presidential system, which is quite different from Lesotho's parliamentary system. I've heard that Senegal has a strong tradition of democracy, with a focus on protecting individual rights and promoting social justice.
That's right. Leah, Senegal has a reputation for being one of the most stable democracies in West Africa. I'm curious, what do you think about the role of the president in Senegal's government?
Well, the president has a significant amount of power, but it's not absolute. There are checks and balances in place to ensure that the president doesn't abuse their power. I've read that Senegal has a strong tradition of civilian rule, which is essential for a stable democracy.
That's fascinating. Leah, the concept of civilian rule is crucial for any country, and Senegal is a great example of how it can work in practice. But what about social harmony in both countries? How do they compare?
That's a great question. Mira, Lesotho has a strong tradition of community-based development, with a focus on rural areas. I've heard that the country has made significant progress in recent years, with improved access to healthcare and education.
That's right. Leah, Lesotho has indeed made significant progress in recent years. But what about Senegal? How does its approach to social harmony compare to Lesotho's?
Well, Senegal has a strong tradition of cultural diversity, with a mix of African, European, and Middle Eastern influences. I've heard that the country has a vibrant arts scene, with a focus on music, dance, and visual arts.
That's fascinating. Leo, the arts are a great way to bring people together and promote social harmony. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural scene in Senegal.
Absolutely. Mira, the cultural scene in Senegal is vibrant and diverse, with a mix of traditional and modern influences. I've read that the country has a strong tradition of storytelling, with a focus on oral traditions and folklore.
That's right. Leo, storytelling is a powerful way to bring people together and promote social harmony. For more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jet Off. Hey, where you can find more in-depth analysis and expert opinions on a range of topics, from politics to culture.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations like this, where we explore the complexities of politics and culture in countries around the world.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of the arts in promoting social harmony. Do you think that art can bring people together and promote understanding?
Absolutely. Mira, art has the power to transcend cultural and linguistic barriers, and can bring people together in a way that few other things can.
That's a great point. Leo, the arts are a powerful tool for promoting social harmony and understanding. And speaking of understanding, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural differences between Lesotho and Senegal.
That's a great topic. Mira, Lesotho has a strong tradition of African culture, with a focus on traditional music, dance, and art. Senegal, on the other hand, has a more diverse cultural heritage, with a mix of African, European, and Middle Eastern influences.
That's fascinating. Leo, the cultural differences between Lesotho and Senegal are quite striking. But what about the economic differences between the two countries? How do they compare?
That's a great question. Mira, Lesotho has a relatively small economy, with a focus on agriculture and mining. Senegal, on the other hand, has a more diverse economy, with a focus on agriculture, industry, and services.
That's right. Leo, the economies of Lesotho and Senegal are quite different, but both countries have made significant progress in recent years. And speaking of progress, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of technology in promoting social harmony in both countries.
That's a great topic. Mira, technology has the power to bring people together and promote understanding. And both Lesotho and Senegal have made significant investments in digital infrastructure.
That's right. Leo, the role of technology in promoting social harmony is a fascinating topic, and one that our listeners would love to learn more about. For now, let's wrap up our conversation on Lesotho and Senegal, two countries with unique approaches to governance and community relations. Thanks for joining me, Leo. So when it comes to economic conditions and cost of living, I think it's essential to look at the job market, income, and overall expenses in both Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious, Leo, have you researched the job market in Lesotho?
Yes, I have. Lesotho has a relatively stable economy, with a growing tourism industry. But the job market is quite limited. It's mostly driven by the government, agriculture, and mining. But if you're looking for a job, the wages are relatively low, around $300, $500 per month.
Well, that's quite a difference from what I've heard about Senegal. From what I've researched, Senegal has a more developed economy, with a growing service sector and a strong focus on tourism. I'm sure our listeners living in Senegal would agree that the cost of living is relatively high, especially in Dakar.
Absolutely. Lira. And I think that's one of the main differences between the two countries. Senegal has a more developed infrastructure, with better roads, schools, and healthcare. But that comes at a cost. The cost of living in Dakar, for example, is around $1, $500. Zara, I think that we can cover that, which is quite high compared to Lesotho.
I see what you mean. But I think it's also essential to look at the cultural context of both countries. In Lesotho, for example, the traditional economy is still quite strong, with many people relying on subsistence farming and livestock. That's something that our listeners living in Lesotho might find fascinating.
Yes. And I think that's one of the things that makes Lesotho so unique. The traditional economy is still very much alive, and it's something that tourists can experience firsthand. But at the same time, I think it's also essential to look at the economic challenges that Lesotho faces, such as poverty and unemployment.
Exactly. Leo. And I think that's where Senegal comes in. Senegal has a more developed economy, but a different set of challenges, such as corruption, inequality. I'm curious. Leo, have you heard anything about the corruption in Senegal?
Yes, unfortunately, I have. Corruption is a major issue in Senegal, and it affects many areas of life, from business to politics. But at the same time, I think it's also essential to look at the positive aspects of Senegal's economy, such as its growing service sector and its strong focus on tourism.
I agree. And I think that's where our listeners come in. If you're considering moving to either Lesotho or Senegal, I think it's essential to do your research and understand the economic conditions and cost of living in each country. And, of course, our listeners can always share their own experiences and insights in the comments.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that makes this podcast so valuable. We're not just talking about numbers and statistics. We're talking about real people and their experiences. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights and perspectives that we bring to the table.
Exactly. Leo. And I think that's why we're doing this podcast. To share our knowledge and insights with our listeners and to help them make informed decisions about their lives. And who knows, maybe one day we'll even have a listener who will share their own experiences and insights about living in Lesotho or Senegal.
Yes, and I think that would be fantastic. We'd love to hear from our listeners and learn more about their experiences. And who knows, maybe one day we'll even have a listener who will share their own economic insights and advice with us.
I'm sure that would be valuable. Leo. And I think that's why we're doing this podcast. To share our knowledge and insights with our listeners and to help them make informed decisions about their lives. And, of course, our listeners can always share their own experiences and insights in the comments.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that makes this podcast so valuable. We're not just talking about numbers and statistics. We're talking about real people and their experiences. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights and perspectives that we bring to the table.
I agree, Leo. And I think that's why we're doing this podcast. To share our knowledge and insights with our listeners and to help them make informed decisions about their lives. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll even have a listener who will share their own experiences and insights about living in Lesotho or Senegal.
Yes, and I think that would be fantastic. We'd love to hear from our listeners and learn more about their experiences. And, who knows, maybe one day we'll even have a listener who will share their own economic insights and advice with us.
I'm sure that would be valuable. Leo, and I think that's why we're doing this podcast. To share our knowledge and insights with our listeners and to help them make informed decisions about their lives. And, of course, our listeners can always share their own experiences and insights in the comments.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that makes this podcast so valuable. We're not just talking about numbers and statistics. We're talking about real people and their experiences. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights and perspectives that we bring to the table.
I agree, Leo. And I think that's why we're doing this podcast. To share our knowledge and insights with our listeners and to help them make informed decisions about their lives. And who knows? Maybe one day we'll even have a listener who will share their own experiences and insights about living in Lesotho or Senegal.
Yes, and I think that would be fantastic. We'd love to hear from our listeners and learn more about their experiences. And, who knows, maybe one day we'll even have a listener who will share their own economic insights and advice with us.
I'm sure that would be valuable, Leo. And I think that's why we're doing this podcast. To share our knowledge and insights with our listeners and to help them make informed decisions about their lives. And, of course, our listeners can always share their own experiences and insights in the comments.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that makes this podcast so valuable. We're not just talking about numbers and statistics. We're talking about real people and their experiences. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights and perspectives that we bring to the table.
I agree, Leo. And I think that's why we're doing this podcast. To share our knowledge and insights with our listeners and to help them make informed decisions about their lives. So let's dive into the world of accommodation options and quality in Lesotho and Senegal. And share some insights from my research and personal experiences.
Yes. The eternal question where to lay your head when traveling or living abroad. I've had my fair share of Lesotho's traditional huts. And let me tell you, they're a real adventure.
I can imagine. Lesotho's traditional huts, or makuro, are indeed a unique experience. But what about modern accommodation options? I found that Lesotho has a growing number of guest houses, lodges, and hotels, especially in the capital city, Maseru.
That's great to hear. I've had some amazing experiences in Senegal's guest houses, too. They're usually family run and offer a warm welcome to visitors. Have you ever stayed in a Senegalese guest house, Mira?
Actually, I have. And it was an incredible experience. The owners were so friendly, and they even invited me to join them for dinner. It was like being part of the family.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Mira, it's kind of like a thing. Can you tell us a bit more about the differences between Lesotho and Senegal's accommodation options?
Sure thing. Lesotho's accommodation options are generally more affordable, especially for budget travelers. You can find a simple room for around 500 Minorities per night. On the other hand, Senegal's prices are a bit higher, but still relatively affordable.
That's interesting. I've noticed that Senegal has a more developed tourism infrastructure, which might contribute to the higher prices. But what about the quality of accommodation? I've heard that Lesotho's huts can be a bit rustic.
That's one way to put it. Yes, Lesotho's traditional huts can be basic, but they're also incredibly charming. And the views are stunning. You can wake up to breathtaking mountain scenery or picturesque villages.
I'm sure the views are lovely, but what about the facilities? I've heard that some of Lesotho's huts can be a bit primitive.
Okay. Let's just say that Lesotho's huts are not for the faint of heart. But if you're looking for a truly immersive cultural experience, they're definitely worth considering.
I'm sure our listeners are just dying to know about the facilities. Mira, can you give us a hint?
Well, let's just say that you might need to use a bucket shower or a traditional toilet. But hey, it's all part of the adventure, right?
I think we've given our listeners enough to think about. Thanks for sharing your insights. Mira.
No problem. Leo, it's been a blast sharing my experiences with you. And to our listeners, I'm curious, have you ever stayed in a traditional hut or guest house in either Lesotho or Senegal? Share your stories with us in the comments.
That's all for this criterion. Folks, stay tuned for our next topic, where we'll be discussing the best places to try local cuisine in both Lesotho and Senegal. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting content.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to deal with visa applications under immigration procedures in a foreign country?
Oh, you know it. I once spent hours at the embassy in South Africa trying to get a visa extension. The line was so long, I thought I'd never get out of there.
That sounds like a nightmare. But I'm sure it's not unique to you or South Africa. I've heard Lesotho has a relatively straightforward process for visa applications.
Actually, I was just reading about Lesotho, and it seems like the government has made some changes to make the process easier for foreigners. They've introduced an online application system, which is a big plus.
That's great to hear. I'm sure many expats would appreciate the convenience of online applications. But what about the actual process itself? Is it still bureaucratic, or have they streamlined it?
Well, from what I've gathered, Lesotho has a relatively simple process for visa applications. You just need to provide some basic documents, like a passport, proof of income, and health insurance.
That sounds manageable. But what about the timeline? How long does it typically take to get a visa?
Good question. I've heard it usually takes around 3 weeks, but sometimes it can take longer. It really depends on the embassy and the type of visa you're applying for.
I see. And what about the cost? Is it expensive to get a visa for Lesotho?
Actually, the cost is relatively low. I think it's around $50 for a single entry visa, and $100 for a multiple entry visa.
That's not too bad. I'm sure many people would be willing to pay that price for a visa to Lesotho. But what about the experience of living in Lesotho? How does the country's culture and way of life impact the visa process and immigration procedures?
Well, Lesotho has a very unique culture, and I think that's part of its charm. The people are very friendly and welcoming, and the country has a strong sense of community.
That's great to hear. I'm sure many expats would appreciate a kind of community and support. But what about the language barrier? Does that pose any challenges for foreigners?
Actually, many people in Lesotho speak English, especially in the cities and tourist areas. But it's always a good idea to learn some basic Lesotho phrases, just to show respect for the culture.
That's a good point. I'm sure many expats would appreciate learning some basic phrases in the local language. But what about the cost of living in Lesotho? Is it affordable for foreigners?
Good question. Lesotho has a relatively low cost of living, especially compared to other countries in Africa. You can find affordable accommodation, food, and transportation, making it a great option for expats on a budget.
That's great to hear. I'm sure many people would be interested in learning more about the cost of living in Lesotho. Now, let's compare that to Senegal. What about the visa process and immigration procedures in Senegal?
Well, Senegal has a more complex process. I'm afraid. The visa application process can be quite lengthy, and the embassy requires a lot of documentation, including proof of income, health insurance, and a police certificate.
That sounds like a lot to deal with. But what about the cost? Is it more expensive to get a visa for Senegal?
Actually, the cost is around $150 for a single entry visa, and $300 for a multiple entry visa.
That's a bit more expensive than Lesotho. But I'm sure many people would still be willing to pay it for a visa to Senegal. But what about the experience of living in Senegal? How does the country's culture and way of life impact the visa process and immigration procedures?
Well, Senegal has a rich cultural heritage, and the people are very welcoming. But the country has a complex history, and there are still some challenges with language and cultural differences.
I see. And what about the language barrier? Does that pose any challenges for foreigners?
Actually, many people in Senegal speak French, especially in the cities and tourist areas. But it's always a good idea to learn some basic Wolof phrases, just to show respect for the culture.
That's a good point. I'm sure many expats would appreciate learning some basic phrases in the local language. But what about the cost of living in Senegal? Is it affordable for foreigners?
Ah, good question. Senegal has a relatively high cost of living, especially compared to Lesotho. You'll need to budget more for accommodation, food, and transportation, making it a less affordable option for some expats.
I see. Well, it seems like both countries have their pros and cons when it comes to visa applications and immigration procedures. But I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about their experiences. Have any of our listeners had any experiences with visa applications and immigration procedures in either Lesotho or Senegal? So, let's talk about access to and quality of health services in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to navigate a healthcare system in either of these countries?
Actually, no, I haven't, but I've heard from friends who have. Lesotho, for example, has a relatively well-developed healthcare system compared to other African countries. But it's still a challenge for expats to access quality care.
That's interesting. I've read that Lesotho has a mix of public and private hospitals, but the public ones are often overcrowded and understaffed. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, it's true. The public hospitals are often overwhelmed with patients, and the facilities can be quite basic. But, on the other hand, the private hospitals are generally better equipped and staffed, making them a more attractive option for expats.
I see. And what about Senegal? I've heard that it has a more developed healthcare system than Lesotho, but I'm not sure if that's true.
Well, Senegal has a more advanced healthcare system, with a mix of public and private hospitals. The public hospitals are generally better equipped and staffed than those in Lesotho, but the private hospitals are still the preferred choice for expats.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they have any experience with the healthcare systems in Lesotho or Senegal? If you've lived in either country, please let us know in the comments.
I think it's worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in improving their healthcare systems in recent years. Lesotho, for example, has implemented a new healthcare policy that aims to improve access to quality care for all citizens.
That's great to hear. And what about the quality of healthcare in Senegal? I've heard that it's generally better than in Lesotho, but I'm not sure if that's true.
Well, Senegal has a more developed healthcare system, with a greater emphasis on prevention and public health. The country also has a number of high-quality private hospitals that offer specialized care.
I see. And what about the cost of healthcare in both countries? I've heard that it can be quite expensive, especially for expats.
Yes, that's true. The cost of healthcare in both countries can be quite high, especially for private care. But, on the other hand, the public hospitals in Lesotho are generally free or low cost, making them a more affordable option for locals.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Lesotho would agree with me that the public hospitals can be quite adventurous. But seriously, the cost of healthcare is a major concern for expats.
Yes, it's a major concern for many expats. But, on the other hand, the healthcare systems in both countries are generally improving, and there are many resources available for expats who need help navigating the system.
That's great to hear. And what about the cultural nuances of healthcare in both countries? I've heard that there are some significant differences between the two.
Yes, that's true. In Lesotho, for example, there is a strong emphasis on traditional healing and folk medicine. In Senegal, on the other hand, there is a greater emphasis on modern Western medicine.
I see. And what about the language barrier? I've heard that English is not widely spoken in either country, which can make it difficult for expats to navigate the healthcare system.
Yes, that's true. In both countries, there are many local languages spoken, and English is not always widely spoken. But, on the other hand, many healthcare professionals in both countries speak some English, especially in the private hospitals.
I'm certain that our listeners who have lived in either country would agree with me that language is a major challenge when it comes to accessing healthcare.
Yes, it's a major challenge, but there are many resources available to help expats overcome the language barrier.
Well, that's all for this topic. I hope our listeners found this information helpful. And if you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments.
Thanks for joining us on this topic. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more informative and entertaining content.
Hey everyone, let's talk about transportation infrastructure and convenience in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm to dive into this topic with Leo, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more about these countries.
Absolutely. Mira, I've had my fair share of wild taxi rides in Lesotho, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the unique experiences we'll share today.
So, let's start with Lesotho. I've heard that the country's transportation infrastructure is quite limited, with a focus on rural roads and a lack of public transit options.
That's right. Lesotho's rural roads can be quite treacherous, especially during the rainy season. But, on the other hand, the country has a great network of hiking trails and scenic routes that showcase its natural beauty.
That's fascinating. I bet our listeners who love hiking would love to explore Lesotho's trails. But what about public transportation? How do people get around in Lesotho?
Well, Mira, Lesotho has a relatively small public transportation network, with buses and taxis being the primary modes of transportation. However, it's not as reliable as you'd like it to be, and prices can be steep.
I see. So, it's a bit of a challenge to get around Lesotho without a car. But what about Senegal? How does its transportation infrastructure compare?
Senegal. Now, that's a country with a well-developed transportation network. From buses to trains, Senegal has a comprehensive public transportation system that's reliable and affordable.
That's great to hear. I heard that Senegal's capital city, Dakar, has a great network of buses and taxis that make it easy to get around.
Exactly. And, with the country's focus on infrastructure development, Senegal is investing heavily in modernizing its transportation system, including the construction of new roads and highways.
I bet our listeners in Senegal are about the country's transportation developments. But what about Lesotho? Are there any plans to improve its transportation infrastructure?
Well, Mira, Lesotho has made some efforts to improve its transportation network, including the construction of new roads and the upgrading of existing ones. However, it's a slow process, and the country still faces significant challenges in terms of funding and capacity.
I see. So it's a big situation for Lesotho. But what about the role of technology in improving transportation infrastructure? Can we expect to see more e-hailing services and ride-sharing apps in Lesotho and Senegal?
That's a great question. Mira, both Lesotho and Senegal have seen an increase in the use of technology to improve transportation, including the adoption of e-hailing services and ride-sharing apps.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the convenience of using ride-sharing apps to get around. But what about the challenges of implementing technology in transportation infrastructure?
Well, Mira, implementing technology in transportation infrastructure could be a complex process, especially in countries with limited resources and infrastructure. But It's an area where both Lesotho and Senegal are making progress.
I bet our listeners who work in the transportation sector will appreciate the challenges of implementing technology in this field. But what about the impact of climate change on transportation infrastructure? How are Lesotho and Senegal addressing this issue?
That's a great question. Mira, climate change is a major concern for both Lesotho and Senegal, and they're taking steps to address its impact on transportation infrastructure. From investing in climate-resilient infrastructure to promoting sustainable transportation options. Both countries are working to reduce their carbon footprint.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the efforts of Lesotho and Senegal to address the impact of climate change on transportation infrastructure. But what about the role of community-led initiatives in improving transportation infrastructure? Can we expect to see more community-led projects in Lesotho and Senegal?
That's a great question. Mira, community-led initiatives are playing an increasingly important role in improving transportation infrastructure in both Lesotho and Senegal. From community-driven transportation projects to community-led advocacy efforts, these initiatives are helping to fill the gap in transportation services.
I see. So, it's a collaborated effort between government, civil society, and community-led initiatives to improve transportation infrastructure in Lesotho and Senegal.
Exactly. Mira, and I think it's a great model for other countries to follow.
I bet our listeners will appreciate the collaborative approach to improving transportation infrastructure. But what about the final thoughts on transportation infrastructure and convenience in Lesotho and Senegal?
Well, Mira, I think it's clear that both Lesotho and Senegal have their unique transportation challenges, but also opportunities for growth and development, from improving public transportation to promoting sustainable transportation options. Both countries are working to create a more efficient and convenient transportation system.
That's a great summary, Leah. And I think our listeners will appreciate the insights we've shared today on transportation infrastructure and convenience in Lesotho and Senegal.
Absolutely. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to think about as they plan their next trip to either Lesotho or Senegal.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences with us in the comments below. If you've got a better transit hack, drop a comment.
I think I'll stick to my wild taxi rides in Lesotho. Mira, but seriously, thank you for joining us today to discuss transportation infrastructure and convenience in Lesotho and Senegal.
The pleasure is mine, Leo. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe on the roads, and happy travels.
And remember, if you're ever in Lesotho or Senegal, just hop in a taxi and hold on tight.
So let's dive into the fascinating world of language barriers and ease of communication in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had to navigate a language barrier while traveling?
Yes, I have. In Lesotho, the official language is Sesotho, but many people also speak English and other local languages. It's not uncommon to see sign language being used in some areas, especially among the older generation. I once tried to order food at a local restaurant and ended up with a plate of something entirely different than what I asked for.
Oh no, that's hilarious. I'm sure the locals were amused by your attempt to communicate. In Senegal, on the other hand, you have Wolof, French, and Pule are as official languages. It's a beautiful example of linguistic diversity, but can be challenging for expats to navigate.
Exactly. And that's where the importance of learning a few key phrases comes in. I found that even a simple hello or thank you in the local language can go a long way in showing respect and building connections with the community.
Absolutely. Leah, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that learning a few local phrases can make a huge difference in their travel experience. Speaking of which, I'm curious, have you ever tried to communicate with a local using gestures or body language?
Yes. I've had my fair share of misadventures with gestures. In Senegal, I once tried to ask for directions using a combination of hand gestures and broken French. Let's just say it didn't quite go as planned.
Oh dear, I can imagine. But it's great that you were willing to try and make an effort to communicate. I'm sure the locals appreciated your enthusiasm, even if your gestures weren't entirely accurate.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. And that's the thing, language barriers can be a challenge, but they're also an opportunity to learn and grow. I mean, how many of us have had to navigate a language barrier at some point in our lives?
Exactly. And it's not just about the language itself, but also about the cultural context and nuances that come with it. In Lesotho, for example, the concept of Ubuntu or humanity towards others is deeply rooted in the culture. It's about being respectful and considerate of others, even if you don't speak the same language.
Oh, I love that concept. And it's something that's very much alive in Senegal as well. The Wolof people, for example, have a rich tradition of oral storytelling and poetry, which is all about conveying meaning and emotion without words.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the cultural context of language in these two countries. Speaking of which, I'm curious, have you ever attended a traditional ceremony or event in Senegal where language wasn't a barrier?
Ah, yes. I once attended a traditional ceremony in Lesotho where the whole community came together to dance and sing. It was an incredible experience. And despite the language barrier, I felt like I was able to connect with the people on a deeper level.
That's wonderful. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that experience. In fact, I think we should invite some of our listeners who have had similar experiences to share their stories with us. What do you think?
That's a great idea. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to share their own stories and experiences with language barriers and cultural communication.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe we even learn a thing or two from each other's experiences. Maybe we'll even pick up a few new languages along the way.
Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot of fun trying. But, in all seriousness, language barriers can be a challenge, but they're also an opportunity to learn and grow. And with a little bit of effort and respect, we can overcome even the most daunting language barriers.
Absolutely. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners would agree that language barriers are just a minor setback in the grand scheme of things. After all, as the saying goes, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, and that includes speaking the local language.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners have picked up some valuable insights and tips for navigating language barriers in Lesotho and Senegal.
Exactly. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners will continue to share their own stories and experiences with us. After all, language barriers are just a minor obstacle in the grand adventure of exploring new cultures and meeting new people. I'm fascinated by Lesotho's unique cultural landscape, where traditional and modern elements blend together seamlessly. From the vibrant textiles to the energetic music, it's a country that celebrates its rich heritage with pride. I'm sure our listeners who have had the chance to visit Lesotho would agree with me that the locals' warm hospitality is unparalleled.
Ah, yes. Lesotho's cultural diversity is indeed a treasure trove of experiences. But let's not forget about Senegal, which boasts an equally impressive blend of traditional and modern influences. The Wolof and Desiar cultures, for example, have had a profound impact on the country's artistic and musical heritage. And have you ever tried the delicious Senegalese cuisine? Yeah, I'm craving some jollof rice right now.
Oh, Leo, you're always about food, aren't you? But seriously, Senegal's cultural diversity is remarkable, and I'm particularly interested in the country's history of tolerance and coexistence. The fact that Muslims, Christians, and animists have lived together for centuries is a testament to the power of social harmony.
Exactly. And it's not just about the numbers. It's about the way people from different backgrounds interact and respect each other's traditions. In Senegal, for example, the concept of Teranga or hospitality is deeply ingrained in the culture. It's a way of life that encourages strangers to feel at home, and it's a quality that's truly unique to the country.
I heard that Lesotho has a similar concept, called Boso, which emphasizes the importance of respect and compassion towards others. It's fascinating to see how different cultures have developed similar values and principles to promote social cohesion.
Ah, yes. Both, though, is a beautiful concept. And it's a reminder that, despite our differences, we're all connected by a shared humanity. But, I must say, I'm curious about the role of education in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. In both Lesotho and Senegal, education is seen as a key factor in shaping young people's values and attitudes towards others.
That's a great point. Leo, education has the power to break down barriers and foster greater understanding between different cultures and communities. In Lesotho, for example, the government has implemented programs to promote bilingualism and multiculturalism in schools, which has helped to reduce tensions and promote greater social cohesion.
Wow, that's impressive. And in Senegal, the government has also implemented initiatives to promote cultural diversity and tolerance, such as the Festival des Arts de la Francophonie, which celebrates the country's rich cultural heritage.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Lesotho and Senegal would agree with me that cultural diversity and tolerance are essential components of a thriving society. It's through embracing our differences and promoting social harmony that we can build stronger, more resilient communities.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both Lesotho and Senegal have made significant strides in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, despite the challenges they face. As we continue to explore these topics, I'm curious about what our listeners think about the role of social media in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. Do you think social media has a positive or negative impact on cultural exchange and understanding?
That's a great question. I think social media can be both a blessing and a curse when it comes to cultural diversity and tolerance. On the one hand, it provides a platform for people to share their cultures and traditions with a global audience, which can be incredibly enriching. On the other hand, it can also perpetuate stereotypes and reinforce negative attitudes towards certain cultures and communities.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that, as we navigate the complexities of cultural diversity and tolerance, we need to be mindful of the impact of our words and actions on others. In both Lesotho and Senegal, there are many initiatives underway to promote cultural diversity and tolerance, from community-led projects to government-supported programs.
I'm curious. Leo, have you had any personal experiences that have taught you about the importance of cultural diversity and tolerance? Perhaps a story or anecdote that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Mira, you're always pushing me to share my personal stories. But, yes, I do have a story that comes to mind. When I was traveling in Lesotho, I was invited to a traditional bustling wedding, which was an incredible experience. The hospitality, the music, the dancing, it was all so vibrant and joyful. And what struck me was the way that guests from different backgrounds came together to celebrate the union, despite their differences.
Well, that's a beautiful story. Leo, it's a testament to the power of cultural diversity and tolerance to bring people together and create meaningful connections. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences in Lesotho and Senegal. Perhaps you could share some of your favorite cultural traditions or customs that you've encountered during your travels?
Mira, you're always encouraging me to share more. But, yes, I'd be happy to share some of my favorite cultural traditions from Lesotho and Senegal. For example, in Lesotho, I was fascinated by the traditional bustling dress, which is a beautiful example of cultural heritage and craftsmanship. And in Senegal, I was blown away by the vibrant street art and murals that reflect the country's rich cultural history.
I'm sure our listeners would love to see some of those images. Leo, perhaps you could share some of your photos or videos from your travels in Lesotho and Senegal. We'd love to share them with our audience.
Mira, you're always about our listeners. But, yes, I'd be happy to share some of my photos and videos from my travels. Perhaps we could even create a special episode or series on cultural diversity and tolerance in Lesotho and Senegal.
That's a great idea. Leo! And I think it's a reminder that, as we explore these topics, we need to be open to new experiences and perspectives. Whether it's through travel, education, or social media. We can all play a role in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both Lesotho and Senegal have made significant strides in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, despite the challenges they face. As we continue to explore these topics, I'm curious about what our listeners think about the role of community-led initiatives in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. Do you think community-led initiatives are more effective than government-led initiatives in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, I think community-led initiatives are often more effective because they're rooted in the local culture and context. They're also more likely to be sustainable and long-term, because they're driven by the needs and interests of the community. So, let's talk about Lesotho and Senegal when it comes to educational opportunities and language schools. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had to learn a new language?
Yes. I've had my fair share of language learning. But I must say, Lesotho's unique culture and history make it an interesting place to learn about. The literacy rate is around 85%, which is quite impressive.
That's amazing. And I'm sure it's due to the efforts of the government and education system. Speaking of which, what are some of the unique educational opportunities that Lesotho offers?
Well, Lesotho has a strong focus on traditional education, which includes learning about the country's history, culture, and language. They also have a program called the Lesotho Institute for Development and Environmental Studies, which provides training on capacity building for educators and community leaders.
That sounds fascinating. And I'm sure it's not just about learning, but also about preserving the culture and language of Lesotho. I'm curious, have you ever had to navigate a floor on language and culture?
Oh, yes. I've had my fair share of language mishaps. But Senegal, on the other hand, has a rich cultural heritage and a strong focus on education. The literacy rate is around 67%, which is still impressive considering the country's history.
That's true. And I'm sure it's due to the efforts of the government and education system. Speaking of which, what are some of the unique educational opportunities that Senegal offers?
Senegal has a strong focus on technical and vocational training, which provides students with skills in areas such as engineering, technology, and entrepreneurship. They also have a program called the Senegal Institute for Higher Education, which provides training and capacity building for educators and community leaders.
That sounds impressive. And I'm sure it's not just about providing skills, but also about empowering the next generation of leaders. I'm curious, what do you think is the most important aspect of language learning?
I think it's the ability to communicate effectively and build relationships with people from different backgrounds. And in Lesotho, the official language is Sesotho. But many people also speak English and other languages.
That's true. And I'm sure it's not just about language, but also about cultural understanding and appreciation. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think language learning is important for personal and professional development?
Absolutely. Language learning is essential for anyone looking to expand their career opportunities or connect with people from different cultures. And in Senegal, the official language is French, but many people also speak Wolof and other languages.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure it's not just about language, but also about cultural understanding and appreciation. I'm curious, have you ever had to deal with language barriers when traveling or working abroad?
Oh, yes. I've had my fair share of language mishaps. But I think the key is to be open-minded and willing to learn. And in Lesotho, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure it's not just about access to education, but also about providing quality education. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think education is the key to personal and professional development?
Absolutely. Education is essential for anyone looking to improve their career prospects or connect with people from different cultures. And in Senegal, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's true. And I'm sure it's not just about access to education, but also about providing quality education. I'm curious, what do you think is the most important aspect of language learning in Lesotho and Senegal?
Ah, I think it's the ability to communicate effectively and build relationships with people from different backgrounds. And in both countries, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure it's not just about language, but also about cultural understanding and appreciation. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think language learning is important for personal and professional development in Lesotho and Senegal?
Absolutely. Language learning is essential for anyone looking to expand their career opportunities or connect with people from different cultures. And in both countries, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's true. And I'm sure it's not just about language, but also about cultural understanding and appreciation. I'm curious, have you ever had to deal with language barriers when traveling or working abroad in Lesotho and Senegal?
Oh, yes. I've had my fair share of language mishaps. But I think the key is to be open-minded and willing to learn. And in both countries, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure it's not just about access to education, but also about providing quality education in Lesotho and Senegal.
Absolutely. Education is essential for anyone looking to improve their career prospects or connect with people from different cultures. And in both countries, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's true. And I'm sure it's not just about access to education, but also about providing quality education. I'm curious, what do you think is the most important aspect of language learning in both countries?
I think it's the ability to communicate effectively and build relationships with people from different backgrounds. And in both countries, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure it's not just about language, but also about cultural understanding and appreciation. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think language learning is important for personal and professional development in Lesotho and Senegal?
Absolutely. Language learning is essential for anyone looking to expand their career opportunities or connect with people from different cultures. And in both countries, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's true. And I'm sure it's not just about language, but also about cultural understanding and appreciation. I'm curious, have you ever had to deal with language barriers when traveling or working abroad in Lesotho and Senegal?
Oh, yes. I've had my fair share of language mishaps. But I think the key is to be open-minded and willing to learn. And in both countries, the government has implemented programs to improve access to education and reduce the language barrier.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure it's not just about access to education, but also, I'm curious about the climate in Lesotho. What do you know about it?
Lesotho, known as the Kingdom in the Sky. It's a landlocked country with a rugged terrain. The temperature varies greatly depending on the altitude, with the highest points reaching above 3,000 meters.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Lesotho experiences a subtropical highland climate, with cold winters and mild summers. But what about the seasons? How do they impact the daily life of the people living there?
Well, the seasons are quite distinct in Lesotho. During the winter months, the temperature can drop to as low as 10 degrees Celsius in the highest areas, while the summer months can see temperatures soar to 25 degrees Celsius. The people of Lesotho have adapted to these conditions by developing a strong culture of resilience and resourcefulness.
I'm certain that others living in Lesotho would agree with me that the climate plays a significant role in shaping their daily lives. But let's compare this to Senegal, the second country on our list. What can you tell us about the climate in Senegal? Leo?
Senegal. Located in West Africa, Senegal has a tropical climate with the distinct seasons: the dry season and the wet season. The dry season, which typically runs from November to June, is characterized by high temperatures and low humidity, while the wet season, which runs from July to October, is marked by heavy rainfall and high humidity.
That's a significant difference from Lesotho. Leo, I'm curious about how the climate in Senegal impacts the local culture. Do the people of Senegal have any unique adaptations to deal with the extreme weather conditions?
Yes, the people of Senegal have developed a strong culture of adaptability and resilience. They have learned to live with the harsh weather conditions, and their daily lives are shaped by the climate. For example, during the wet season, the people of Senegal often move to higher ground to avoid flooding, while during the dry season, they focus on agriculture and trade.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the climate in Lesotho or Senegal is more challenging to adapt to?
Well, I think it's a tough call. Both countries have their unique challenges, but in different ways. Lesotho's climate is more unpredictable, with sudden changes in temperature and weather patterns, while Senegal's climate is more seasonal, with distinct wet and dry seasons.
That's a great point. Leo, I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a rich cultural heritage that is deeply connected to their climate and natural environment. The people of Lesotho and Senegal have developed unique traditions and practices that are shaped by their climate and geography.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes these countries so fascinating to learn about. The way that the climate and culture intersect is a unique and fascinating aspect of these countries.
I completely agree. Leo, and speaking of climate and culture, I'm curious about the impact of climate change on these countries. Do you think that climate change will have a significant impact on the daily lives of the people living in Lesotho and Senegal?
That's a great question. Mira, climate change is a major concern for both Lesotho and Senegal, and it's likely to have a significant impact on the daily lives of the people living in these countries. Rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and increased frequency of extreme weather events will all have a significant impact on the agriculture, water resources, and infrastructure of these countries.
That's a sobering thought. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would agree that climate change is a major concern for these countries. But what can we do to help mitigate the effects of climate change in Lesotho and Senegal?
Well, there are many ways to help mitigate the effects of climate change in these countries. For example, we can support sustainable agriculture practices, reduce our carbon footprint, and invest in climate-resilient infrastructure.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think it's also worth noting that the people of Lesotho and Senegal are already taking steps to address the impacts of climate change. They are developing innovative solutions to adapt to the changing climate, and we can learn from their examples.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes these countries so inspiring to learn about. The resilience and resourcefulness of the people of Lesotho and Senegal is a testament to their strength and adaptability.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. But I'm curious about what our listeners think about climate and seasonal conditions in Lesotho and Senegal. Do you have any comments or questions about this topic?
Well, I think that's a great way to end the conversation. Let's hear from our listeners and see what they have to say about climate and seasonal conditions in Lesotho and Senegal.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried the Sodium beer in Lesotho? It's a traditional brew made from sorghum and maize.
Yes, I have. It's quite an acquired taste, but I love the cultural significance behind it. The locals call it Hala, and it's usually served at social gatherings and ceremonies.
That's so cool. I've heard that Lesotho's cuisine is heavily influenced by its mountainous terrain, which affects the types of crops that can be grown. They have a lot of traditional dishes like papa, which is a type of cornmeal porridge.
Exactly. And papa is a staple in many Basudio households. I've also had the chance to try some of their unique meats like mopani worms and grasshoppers. They're a great source of protein.
I don't think I could ever eat insects. But I do admire the resourcefulness of the Basudio people. And speaking of resourcefulness, have you heard about the Lesotho's food and nutrition security strategy? It's a government initiative to improve food access and nutrition in the country.
Ah, yes. I read about it. It's a great example of how a country can come together to address food security issues. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that access to nutritious food is a basic human right.
Absolutely. And I'm curious. Have you ever tried any of the traditional Senegalese dishes like the Beauties and any or Mofe? They're both made with rice and meat or fish.
Yes, I have. The bo, you die, and eou die, and any is a hearty fish that's popular in Senegal. And mafe is a peanut based that's rich in flavor and nutrients.
That sounds delicious. I've also heard that Senegal has a strong tradition of street food, with vendors selling everything from grilled meats to fresh fruit.
Exactly. And the street food in Senegal is amazing. I've had some of the best grilled fish and yassé from street vendors.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the importance of street food in Senegal. Do you think it's a key part of the country's food culture?
Ah, definitely. Street food is a big part of Senegal's culinary identity, and I think it's a great way to experience the local culture and try new flavors.
Well, I think we've only scratched the surface of the food culture in both Lesotho and Senegal. But I'd love to hear more about our listeners' experiences with these countries' cuisine. Have you tried any of the traditional dishes or street food in either country?
Yes, I have. And I think our listeners would agree that trying new foods is a big part of the travel experience. It's a great way to learn about the local culture and cuisine.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I love about traveling. Trying new foods and drinks is always an adventure. Okay, let's talk about the nutritional alternatives in these countries. Have you heard about the Lesotho's National Nutrition Strategy? It's a government initiative to improve nutrition and food security in the country.
Ah, yes, I've read about it. It's a great example of how a country can come together to address nutrition issues. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that nutrition is a key part of overall health and well-being.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, have you ever tried any of the traditional Senegalese dishes that are high in nutrients like fufu or akara? They're both made with ingredients like cassava or beans.
Yes, I have. Fufu is a traditional dish made from cassava or yams, and it's a great source of fiber and nutrients. And akara is a type of fried bean cake that's rich in protein and fiber.
That sounds delicious. And I've also heard that Senegal has a strong tradition of using local ingredients to make healthy dishes. Do you think that's something that our listeners would be interested in learning more about?
Ah, definitely. Using local ingredients is a great way to promote sustainable agriculture and support local farmers. And I think our listeners would agree that eating healthy is an important part of maintaining a balanced lifestyle.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation about food culture and nutritional alternatives in Lesotho and Senegal. But I'd love to hear more about our listeners' experiences with these countries' cuisine. Have you tried any of the traditional dishes or street food in either country?
Yes, I have. And I think our listeners would agree that trying new foods is a big part of the travel experience. It's a great way to learn about the local culture and cuisine.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I love about traveling. Trying new foods and drinks is always an adventure. Okay, let's talk about the culinary heritage of Lesotho. Have you ever tried any of the traditional Bosotho dishes like pap and vielis or elitsai?
Yes, I have. Pap and vielis is a traditional dish made from cornmeal porridge and meat or beans, and it's a staple in many Bosotho households. And elitsai is a type of sweet potato dish that's popular in Lesotho.
That sounds delicious. And I've also heard that Lesotho has a rich tradition of storytelling through food. Do you think that's something that our listeners would be interested in learning more about?
Ah, definitely. Storytelling through food is a great way to learn about the local culture and traditions. And I think our listeners would agree that food is a universal language that brings people together.
Well, I think we've only scratched the surface of the food culture in Lesotho and Senegal. But I'd love to hear more about our listeners' experiences with these countries' cuisine. Have you tried any of the traditional dishes or street food in either country?
Yes, I have. And I think our listeners would agree that trying new foods is a big part of the travel experience. It's a great way to learn about the local culture and cuisine.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I love about traveling. Trying new foods and drinks is always an adventure. Okay, let's wrap up this conversation about food, culture, and nutritional alternatives in Lesotho and Senegal. Thank you, Leo, for sharing your insights and experiences with these countries' cuisine.
It was my pleasure. I think our listeners would agree that food is a key part of any travel experience. And I'm sure they
Dive into the historical, cultural, and artistic values of Lesotho and Senegal. Lesotho, a small country landlocked by South Africa, boasts an incredible array of ancient landmarks, including the Thaba fortress, which dates back to the 19th century.
That's fascinating. And speaking of fascinating, have you ever tried the traditional bustling beer, which is brewed from sorghum and has been a staple in Lesotho for centuries?
Yes, I've had my fair share of it. But let's get back to the historical side of things. Lesotho has a rich history, with the San people being the first inhabitants, followed by the Bantu-speaking people.
And that's where the incredible art and cultural heritage come in. The Bustling people have a deep connection to their land and their traditions, which is reflected in their vibrant textiles, music, and dance.
Exactly. And jet off. I love uncovering stories like this. And so do we. Lesotho's cultural heritage is a true treasure trove of African traditions.
Absolutely. And speaking of treasures, have you ever heard of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project? It's a massive water project that showcases the country's engineering prowess.
Yes, I've heard of it. But let's talk about Senegal, which has a rich cultural heritage of its own. From the Wolof Empire to the French colonial era, Senegal has a complex and fascinating history.
And that's reflected in its art and culture, which is a beautiful blend of African, European, and Islamic influences. The vibrant colors and patterns of Senegalese textiles are a testament to this rich cultural heritage.
I completely agree. And I'm curious, have our listeners ever been to a Senegalese festival like the Grand Magal of Tubier? It's an incredible celebration of culture and faith.
Yes, I've been there. And it's truly an experience like no other. The energy, the music, the food, it's all just so incredible.
And let's not forget about the art scene in Senegal. From the vibrant murals in Dakar to the stunning architecture of the Grand Mosque, Senegal is a treasure trove of artistic expression.
Absolutely. And I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me. The art and culture of Senegal are truly unique and worth exploring.
Well, it's clear that both Lesotho and Senegal have a rich cultural heritage that's worth learning about. And if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the resources on JetOff AI, where you can find all sorts of fascinating articles and stories about these incredible countries.
And speaking of fascinating, have you ever heard of the legendary musician Youssou N'Dour from Senegal? He's a true icon of African music and culture.
Yes, I've heard of him. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most important aspect of cultural heritage in these two countries?
That's a tough question. But I think it's the way that both Lesotho and Senegal have managed to preserve their traditional ways of life while still embracing modernity and progress.
That's a great point. Yeah, and I think that's what makes these countries so unique and fascinating to learn about. And speaking of uniqueness, have you ever tried the traditional Senegalese dish? Thibia Udainani?
Yes, I have. And it's absolutely delicious. The combination of rice, fish, and vegetables is just incredible.
Well, it's clear that both Lesotho and Senegal have a rich cultural heritage that's worth exploring. And if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the resources on JetOff AI, where you can find all sorts of fascinating articles and stories about these incredible countries.
And speaking of incredible countries, Have you ever heard of the Lesotho National Museum? It's a treasure trove of cultural artifacts and historical relics that showcase the country's rich heritage.
Ah, yes, I've heard of it. And I'm curious. What do you think is the most important thing that visitors can take away from a trip to Lesotho or Senegal?
That's a tough question. But I think it's the way that both countries have managed to preserve their traditional ways of life while still embracing modernity and progress.
That's a great point. Leo. And I think that's what makes these countries so unique and fascinating to learn about. And speaking of uniqueness, have you ever tried the traditional Lesotho dish? Morehe?
Ah, yes, I have. And it's absolutely delicious. The combination of cornmeal and vegetables is just incredible.
Well, it's clear that both Lesotho and Senegal have a rich cultural heritage that's worth exploring. And if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the resources on Jet Off AI, where you can find all sorts of fascinating articles and stories about these incredible countries.
And speaking of incredible countries, have you ever heard of the Senegalese writer, Asmain Sambane? He's a true icon of African literature and culture.
Ah, yes, I've heard of him. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing that visitors can take away from a trip to Lesotho or Senegal?
That's a tough question. But I think it's the way that both countries have managed to preserve their traditional ways of life while still embracing modernity and progress.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's what makes these countries so unique and fascinating to learn about. And speaking of uniqueness, have you ever tried the traditional Senegalese dance? The Saba?
Ah, yes, I have. And it's absolutely incredible. The combination of drumming and dance is just mesmerizing.
Well, it's clear that both Lesotho and Senegal have a rich cultural heritage that's worth exploring. And if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the resources on Jet Off AI, where you can find all sorts of fascinating articles and stories about these incredible countries.
And speaking of incredible countries, have you ever heard of the Lesotho Highlands? It's a stunning natural wonder that's just breathtaking.
Ah, yes, I've heard of it. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing that visitors can take away from a trip to Lesotho or Senegal?
But I think it's the way that both countries have managed to preserve their traditional ways of life while still embracing modernity and progress.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's what makes these countries so unique and fascinating to learn about. And so to talk about the natural beauties and landscapes of Lesotho and Senegal, I mean, who wouldn't want to explore the majesty of the Maluti Mountains in Lesotho or the stunning coastlines of Senegal?
Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm loving the vibe of this conversation already. You know, if we were to create a postcard for Lesotho, it would be all about the snow-capped mountains and the traditional villages.
That's a great idea. And for Senegal, it would be all about the vibrant colors of the markets and the beautiful beaches. But I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to Lesotho? I've heard the scenery is breathtaking.
Actually, no, I haven't been to Lesotho, but I've seen some amazing pictures. And I'm sure it's just as stunning as the pictures make it out to be. But speaking of Senegal, have you heard about the famous Pink Lake in Senegal?
Oh, yes. I've heard it's a natural wonder. But I'm not sure if it's as pink as it sounds. I mean, I've seen some pictures, but I'm curious. How pink is it really?
Well, let me tell you, it's definitely pink. And it's not just a little bit pink, it's a deep, bright pink. I mean, it's like nothing you've ever seen before.
Well, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding Senegal's Pink Lake to my bucket list. And Leo, I'm curious. What do you think is the most unique feature of Lesotho's landscape?
Ah, that's a great question. I think it's the way the mountains meet the valleys. I mean, it's like nature's own work of art. And it's not just the scenery, but the traditional villages and the people are just as beautiful.
I completely agree. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the traditional villages in Lesotho. Can you tell us a bit more about them? Leo?
Sure thing. The traditional villages in Lesotho are just amazing. They're built into the mountainsides, and they're made from local stone and thatch. And the people are just as warm and welcoming as the scenery.
That sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to visit one of these villages someday. And, Leo, I'm curious. Have you ever been to Senegal? I've heard the beaches are stunning.
Actually, yes, I have been to Senegal, and I can confirm that the beaches are just as stunning as everyone says. But I have to say, the most memorable experience I had in Senegal was not the beach, but the vibrant markets.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I love markets, and I'm sure our listeners do too. Can you tell us a bit more about the markets in Senegal? Leo?
Sure thing. The markets in Senegal are just incredible. They're filled with colorful textiles, traditional handicrafts, and delicious food. And the people are just as vibrant and energetic as the markets.
That sounds like a dream come true. I'm sure our listeners would love to visit one of these markets someday. And, Leo, I'm curious, what do you think is the most unique feature of Senegal's landscape?
That's a great question. I think it's the way the coastline meets the desert. I mean, it's like two worlds colliding. And it's not just the scenery, but the people and the culture are just as unique.
I completely agree. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the culture of Senegal. Can you tell us a bit more about it? Leo?
Sure thing. The culture of Senegal is just incredible. It's a blend of African, French, and Portuguese influences. And it's reflected in the music, dance, and
That sounds fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the culture of Senegal. And, Leo, I'm curious, have you ever tried any of the local cuisine in Senegal?
Actually, yes. I have tried some of the local cuisine in Senegal, and I can confirm that it's just delicious. But I have to say, the most memorable experience I had was not the food, but the way the people came together to celebrate.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I love the idea of people coming together to celebrate. Can you tell us a bit more about the celebrations in Senegal? Leo?
Sure thing. The celebrations in Senegal are just incredible. They're filled with music, dance, and traditional handicrafts. And the people are just as warm and welcoming as the scenery.
That sounds like a dream come true. I'm sure our listeners would love to experience one of these celebrations someday. And, Leo, I'm curious, what do you think is the most unique feature of Lesotho's landscape?
That's a great question. I think it's the way the mountains meet the valleys. I mean, it's like nature's own work of art. And it's not just the scenery, but the traditional villages and the people are just as beautiful.
I completely agree. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the traditional villages in Lesotho. Can you tell us a bit more about them? Leo?
Sure thing. The traditional villages in Lesotho are just amazing. They're built into the mountainsides, and they're made from local stone and thatch. And the people are just as warm and welcoming as the scenery.
That sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to visit one of these villages someday. And, Leo, I'm curious, have you ever tried any of the local cuisine in Lesotho?
Actually, yes. I have tried some of the local cuisine in Lesotho, and I can confirm that it's just delicious. But I have to say, the most memorable experience I had was not the food, but the way the people came together to celebrate.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I love the idea of people coming together to celebrate. Can you tell us a bit more about the celebrations in Lesotho? Leo?
Sure thing. The celebrations in Lesotho are just incredible. They're filled with music, dance, and traditional handicrafts. And the people are just as warm and welcoming as the scenery.
That sounds like a dream come true. I'm sure our listeners would love to experience one of these celebrations someday. And, Leo, I'm curious, What do you think is the most unique feature of Senegal's landscape?
Ah, that's a great question. I think it's the way the coastline meets.
So, let's talk about sports and adventure options in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to Lesotho?
Actually, Mira, I've been to Lesotho, and it's a beautiful country with stunning mountains and valleys. The people are also very warm and welcoming. I was impressed by the traditional bustling culture and the vibrant music and dance.
That's great to hear. Leo, I've heard that Lesotho is a great destination for hikers and trekkers. The Maluti Mountains offer some of the most spectacular views and challenging trails in Africa. Have you tried any of the local hiking trails?
Yes, I have. And I can tell you that the scenery is breathtaking. The trails are well marked, and the locals are always willing to help. I even got to try some of the local cuisine, which is delicious. But I have to say, I was a bit by the number of horses and donkeys on the trails.
Yes, I've heard that Lesotho is known for its horseback riding and horse-drawn transportation. It's a great way to explore the countryside and get a feel for the local culture. But let's talk about Senegal for a moment. What do you know about the surfing scene in Senegal?
Senegal. The surfing scene is quite popular there, especially in the Dakar region. The waves are consistent, and the locals are very friendly. I've heard that the surfing community is growing rapidly, and it's becoming a major tourist attraction.
That's great to hear. I've been to Dakar, and the surfers are always so enthusiastic and welcoming. But I have to say, I was a bit by the number of surf schools and rental shops along the coast. It's clear that surfing is a big part of the local culture.
Yes. It's amazing how much surfing has taken off in Senegal. And it's not just surfing, the whole water sports scene is thriving. From kayaking to paddle boarding. There's something for everyone.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the water sports scene in Senegal. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But moving on to Lesotho, what do you know about the traditional sports in Lesotho?
Traditional sports. Well, Mira, I've heard that the traditional sport of Lesotho is a game called Mak Horo, which is a form of wrestling. It's a very physical and intense sport that requires a lot of strength and endurance.
Wow, that sounds intense. I've heard that Makhoro is a very important part of their culture and is often performed during traditional ceremonies and festivals. Have you ever seen a Makhoro match?
Yes, I have, and it's an incredible experience. The energy and passion of the players are infectious, and it's clear that Makhoro is a beloved part of Lesotho's cultural heritage.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Makhoro and the other traditional sports in Lesotho. Do you think our listeners living in Lesotho or Senegal would agree with me that these traditional sports are an essential part of their cultural identity?
Absolutely. Mira, I think it's clear that traditional sports like Makhoro and surfing in Senegal are an integral part of the local culture and identity. They bring people together, promote physical activity, and preserve cultural heritage.
Well, there you have it. Folks, Lesotho and Senegal offer a wealth of sports and adventure options that are sure to get your heart racing and your spirits soaring. Whether you're a seasoned athlete or just looking for a new challenge, there's something for everyone in these two amazing countries. Oh, when it comes to nightlife, I'm of less vibrant scenes in Senegal's electrifying parties. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of nightlife in these two countries? Leo?
Well, Mira, I think Lesotho's nightlife is all about traditional folk music and dancing, while Senegal's is more about fusion of traditional and modern styles. But what I love about both countries is the way they come together to celebrate.
Exactly. And speaking of coming together, I'm sure our listeners living in Lesotho would agree with me that the traditional folk music and dancing are an integral part of the nightlife scene. It's all about community and celebration.
That's right, Mira. And I think Senegal's nightlife is a bit more lively, shall we say, with its rich musical heritage and vibrant street art. It's a party lover's paradise.
I love that you used the word lively. And I think it's great that Senegal's nightlife is so diverse and inclusive. But what about Lesotho's nightlife? What are some of the popular spots that our listeners should check out?
Lesotho's got some amazing spots. Yeah, the town of Maseru has a great nightlife scene, with bars and clubs that stay open late into the night. And if you're looking for something more traditional, you can check out the local shibines, which are basically community-run bars that serve up great local drinks and music.
Ooh, I'm so intrigued by the Shibines, and I think our listeners would love to hear more about them. Can you tell us a bit more about what it's like to experience a Shibin? Leo?
Well, Mira, it's definitely an experience. The shibines are usually small, family-run operations that serve up traditional drinks and food. And the music is always lively, with local bands playing traditional folk music.
That sounds amazing, and I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about Senegal's nightlife? What are some of the popular spots that we should check out?
Senegal's got a great nightlife scene. Mira, the city of Dakar has a great selection of bars and clubs, and the music scene is always lively. You can check out the famous Gori Island, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a hub for local music and art.
Wow, I'm so impressed by the variety of nightlife options in both countries. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about the local music and art scenes. Can you tell us a bit more about what it's like to experience the music and art in Senegal? Leo?
Well, Mira, the music and art scenes in Senegal are incredibly vibrant and diverse. You can experience the local music at the famous Theatre National du Senegal, which hosts a variety of performances throughout the year. And the art scene is all about vibrant colors and eclectic styles, with a mix of traditional and modern influences.
That sounds amazing, and I think our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about the nightlife in Lesotho? What are some of the popular events and festivals that we should check out?
Lesotho's got some amazing events and festivals. Mira, the annual Lesotho National Day celebrations are a great way to experience the local culture and music. And if you're looking for something more traditional, you can check out the local bustling cultural events, which showcase traditional music and dance.
Ooh, I'm so to hear about these events and festivals. And I think our listeners would love to experience them for themselves. But what about the nightlife in Senegal? What are some of the popular events and festivals that we should check out?
Senegal's got some amazing events and festivals. Mira, the annual Dakar Jazz Festival is a great way to experience the local music scene. And if you're looking for something more traditional, you can check out the local Wolof cultural events, which showcase traditional music and dance.
Wow, I'm so impressed by the variety of nightlife options in both countries. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about the local music and art scenes. Can you tell us a bit more about what it's like to experience the music and art in Lesotho? Leo?
Well, Mira, the music and art scenes in Lesotho are all about traditional folk music and vibrant colors. You can experience the local music at the famous Thababa Sayu Cultural Village, which hosts a variety of performances throughout the year. And the art scene is all about traditional crafts and textiles, with a mix of modern influences.
That sounds amazing. And I think our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about the nightlife in Senegal? What are some of the popular spots that we should check out?
Senegal's got some amazing spots. Mira, the city of Dakar has a great selection of bars and clubs, and the music scene is always lively. You can check out the famous place DLA Toil, which is a hub for local music and art.
Wow, I'm so impressed by the variety of nightlife options in both countries. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about the local music and art scenes. Can you tell us a bit more about what it's like to experience the music and art in Senegal? Leo?
Well, Mira, the music and art scenes in Senegal are incredibly vibrant and diverse. You can experience the local music at the famous Theatre National du Senegal, which hosts a variety of performances throughout the year. And the art scene is all about vibrant colors and eclectic styles, with a mix of traditional and modern influences.
That sounds amazing. And I think our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about the nightlife in Lesotho? What are some of the popular events and festivals that we should check out?
Lesotho's got some amazing events and festivals. Mira, The annual SO, the National Days, are a great way to experience the local culture and music. And if you're looking for something more traditional, you can check out the local Basso cultural events, which showcase traditional music and dance.
Oh, I'm sad to hear about these events and festivals, and I think our listeners would love to experience them for themselves. But what about the nightlife in Senegal? What are some of the popular events and festivals that we should check out?
Senegal's got some amazing events and festivals. Mira, the annual Dakar Jazz Festival is a great way to experience the local music scene. And if you're looking for something more traditional, you can check out the local Wolof cultural events, which showcase traditional music and dance.
Wow, I'm so impressed by the variety of... So, let's dive into family-friendly environments and children's activities in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious to see how these two countries nurture their young ones.
Great choice of topics. I've got some fun facts to share. Lesotho, for instance, has a strong focus on community-based initiatives that promote family bonding and child development.
That's wonderful to hear. I've always believed that community plays a vital role in shaping young minds. In Lesotho, do you think the traditional bustling culture influences the way families interact with their children?
Absolutely. Mira, the bustling culture values respect for elders and community members, which trickles down to how children are raised. It's a very hands-on approach, with grandparents and community members often taking on a mentorship role.
I see what you mean. It's like a village raising a child, rather than just the parents. That's so heartwarming to see. Now, let's talk about Senegal. I've heard their capital, Dakar, has some amazing children's museums and parks.
You're right. Senegal has a rich cultural heritage, and the museums and parks are indeed fantastic. But what I find fascinating is the way Senegalese families prioritize education and personal development for their children.
That's so true. In Senegal, I've noticed that education is highly valued, and parents often send their children to private schools to give them a head start. But what about traditional family activities? Do they have any unique customs or games that promote family bonding?
Yes. In Senegal, there's a traditional game called NBA Lax that's played during special occasions. It's a fun way for families to come together and dance, while also passing down cultural traditions to the younger generation.
Relax sounds like a blast. I'd love to learn more about it. If you think about it, both Lesotho and Senegal have a strong emphasis on community and family values. I'm sure our listeners would agree that these are essential for raising happy and well-adjusted children.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's great that we're highlighting these countries' unique approaches to family-friendly environments. It's a great reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to raising children.
That's so true. And speaking of unique approaches, I've heard that Lesotho has some amazing hiking trails that are perfect for families. Have you ever hiked in Lesotho? Leo?
Yes, I have. And it was an incredible experience. The scenery is breathtaking, and the locals are so friendly and welcoming. It's a great way to get some exercise and spend quality time with the family.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your hiking adventures in Lesotho. If you could recommend one family-friendly hike, what would it be?
That's a tough choice, but I'd say the Maluti Mountains are a must-see. The views are stunning, and the trails are well-marked and suitable for families with children.
That sounds amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners will take note. Now, let's talk about Senegal's family-friendly activities. I heard that their capital, Dakar, has a beautiful botanical garden that's perfect for families.
Yes. The Jardin Botanique de Dakar is a hidden gem. The garden is designed to be accessible for families with strollers, and there are plenty of interactive exhibits and activities to keep kids engaged.
That sounds like a great place to spend the day with the family. And speaking of interactive exhibits, I've heard that Senegal has some amazing children's museums that are both educational and fun.
Yes. The Musée des Civilisations DL Occident is a fantastic museum that showcases the history and culture of the Western world in a way that's engaging for children. And the best part is that it's free to visit.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate that. If you think about it, both Lesotho and Senegal have a strong emphasis on preserving their cultural heritage and passing it down to future generations.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's great that we're highlighting these countries' unique approaches to family-friendly environments. It's a great reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to raising children.
That's so true. And speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Lesotho has some amazing traditional dances that are perfect for families to enjoy together.
Ah, yes. The Bustling people have a rich cultural heritage, and their traditional dances are a great way to experience it. And the best part is that they're often performed during special occasions, such as weddings and festivals.
That sounds like a great way to experience the culture. And speaking of festivals, I've heard that Senegal has some amazing music and dance festivals that are perfect for families to enjoy together.
Ah, yes. The Dakar International Festival is a fantastic event that showcases the best of Senegalese music and dance. And the best part is that it's a great way to experience the local culture and meet new people.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences at the festival. If you could recommend one family-friendly festival in Senegal, what would it be?
Ah, that's a tough choice. But I'd say the Fête des Tambourines is a must-see. It's a fantastic celebration of music and dance that's perfect for families.
That sounds amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners will take note. So, let's talk about LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the vibrant pride events in these countries?
Actually, I have. Lesotho's pride celebrations are quite unique, with a strong focus on community and inclusivity. The country's small size allows for a tight-knit community, which I think contributes to the warmth and acceptance.
That's wonderful to hear. I've read that Senegal has a strong tradition of welcoming and accepting people from all walks of life. But, Leo, I have to ask, what's the situation like in Lesotho? I mean, Lesotho, when it comes to legal protections for LGBT individuals.
Ah, good question. Well, Lesotho's laws are still evolving. There are efforts to create more inclusive policies. For example, the government has introduced measures to protect LGBT individuals from harassment and violence.
That's a great start. I'm sure our listeners living in Lesotho would agree that every step towards inclusivity is a step in the right direction. And, Leo, I'm curious, have you heard about the inspiring community stories in Senegal?
Yes, I have. Senegal's LGBT community is quite active and vocal, with many individuals advocating for their rights and promoting acceptance. In fact, Senegal has even hosted its own pride events, which are a testament to the country's growing inclusivity.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that the cultural attitudes in these countries are shifting towards greater acceptance of LGBT individuals?
That's a great question. Well, there's certainly progress being made. I think it's also important to acknowledge the challenges that still exist. For example, in both Lesotho and Senegal, there are still social and cultural norms that can be quite conservative.
That's a fair point. Leo, but I have to say, I'm heartened to hear about the efforts being made to promote inclusivity and acceptance in these countries. And, Leo, I'm sure you'll agree that it's essential to celebrate the diversity of human experience.
Absolutely. As we've seen in both Lesotho and Senegal, the rainbow is a symbol of hope and inclusivity, and it's essential that we continue to promote and celebrate it.
Well, I think we've only just scratched the surface of this topic, but I'm to continue exploring the LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Lesotho and Senegal. And, Leo, I'm curious. What do you think is the most important thing that we can learn from these countries?
That's a great question. I think one of the key takeaways is the importance of community and inclusivity. In both Lesotho and Senegal, the LGBT community has come together to advocate for their rights and promote acceptance.
That's so true. Leo, and I think it's also worth noting that, as we've seen in both countries, the struggle for LGBT rights is not just about individual rights, but also about community and social acceptance.
Exactly. And, as we continue to explore this topic, I'm sure we'll learn even more about the complexities and nuances of LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Lesotho and Senegal.
Well, I think that's all for now. But I'm to continue this conversation in our next episode. And, Leo, I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about the LGBT-friendly atmospheres in these countries.
Absolutely. And, as we wrap up this episode, I'd like to say that it's been a pleasure exploring this topic with Mira, and I'm to continue this conversation in the future.
And to our listeners, I'd like to say thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery and exploration. Remember, as we've seen in both Lesotho and Senegal, the power of community and inclusivity can bring about real change.
Well said, Mira. And to our listeners, I'd like to say that we welcome your thoughts and comments on this topic. Let's continue the conversation.
I'm sure our listeners know that Lesotho and Senegal have a strong sense of community. But I'm curious to explore their hospitality towards foreigners. Have you ever been to Lesotho? Leo?
Actually, I have, Mira. And I must say, the Bustling people are incredibly welcoming. They're known for their warm and open arms. In fact, I once stayed with a local family in Mashu, and they treated me like one of their own.
That's amazing. I've heard that Senegalese people are also very friendly. In fact, the concept of Teranga in Senegal means hospitality in English. But what's the difference between the two countries' approaches to hospitality?
Well, Mira, I think Lesotho's hospitality is more informal and family-oriented. When I stayed with the local family, they fed me traditional food, and we spent hours talking and laughing together. It was like being part of the family.
That's so cool. I've heard that Senegalese people are also known for their love of food and hospitality. But what about the formal aspects of hospitality in Senegal? Don't they have a more structured approach to welcoming foreigners?
Yes. In Senegal, the formal aspect of hospitality is indeed more structured. They have a concept called YLMA, which refers to the respect and dignity shown to guests. It's a very important part of Senegalese culture, and they take it very seriously.
I see what you mean. In Lesotho, the hospitality is more, well, let's say, down to earth. But in Senegal, it's more formal and respectful. I'm curious to know, Leo, have you ever experienced any cultural faux pas while visiting Senegal?
Yes. I once accidentally used my left hand to eat with, which is considered impolite in Senegal. But my hosts were very understanding, and we all had a good laugh about it.
Oh no, that's hilarious. I'm sure our listeners can relate to making cultural mistakes. But what about the language barrier in Lesotho? Don't people struggle with communication when foreigners visit?
Yes. Language can be a challenge in Lesotho, but the Bustling people are very resourceful. They often use hand gestures and simple English to communicate with foreigners. And in Senegal, many people speak French, so communication is generally easier.
That's a good point. I've heard that Senegal is one of the most multilingual countries in Africa. But what about the cultural norms around integration in Lesotho? Don't people struggle with adjusting to foreign customs and traditions?
Yes. Integration can be a challenge in Lesotho, but the Bustling people are generally very open-minded. They welcome foreigners with open arms and are eager to learn about different cultures.
I see what you mean. In Senegal, the cultural norms around integration are also very welcoming. But what about the economic aspect of hospitality in both countries? Don't people struggle with making a living while visiting or living in these countries?
Yes. The economic aspect of hospitality can be a challenge in both countries. But in Lesotho, the cost of living is generally lower, and foreigners can find affordable accommodation and food. In Senegal, the cost of living is higher, but the economy is more developed, and foreigners can find better job opportunities.
I see what you mean. So, in summary, Lesotho's hospitality is more informal and family-oriented, while Senegal's hospitality is more formal and respectful. But both countries have a strong sense of community and welcome foreigners with open arms.
Exactly. Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a unique approach to hospitality that reflects their cultural heritage and traditions. It's a fascinating topic to explore, and I'm sure our listeners have many more questions about it.
I'm sure they do. Leo, and we'd love to hear from them. If you have any questions or experiences about hospitality in Lesotho or Senegal, please let us know in the comments below.
And if you're planning a trip to either country, be sure to learn a few words of the local language and respect the cultural norms and traditions.
That's a great tip. Leo, and don't forget to try the local cuisine and drinks. They're delicious.
Ah, yes. The food in both countries is amazing. And I think we should wrap up this topic here. But we'll be back with more exciting topics and discussions. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more fun and informative content. We'll see you in the next episode. So, let's talk about Lesotho and Senegal, two countries with vastly different internet infrastructures. In Lesotho, the government has made significant efforts to expand internet access, but challenges remain. For instance, the country's terrain makes it difficult to install fiber optic cables.
I can imagine. Lesotho's mountainous landscape is quite challenging for infrastructure development. But, Mira, you know what they say when life gives you mountains? Build a tunnel. Or in this case, install some satellite internet.
Well, that's one way to look at it. But seriously, Lesotho's internet penetration rate is still relatively low, especially in rural areas. In contrast, Senegal has made significant strides in digital infrastructure development, with a focus on expanding fiber optic cables and improving internet speeds.
Senegal is indeed a digital hub in West Africa. Their efforts to improve internet connectivity have paid off, with many urban areas now enjoying high-speed internet. But, Mira, have you considered the impact of digital nomadism on these countries? With the rise of remote work, many digital nomads are drawn to countries with reliable internet and affordable living costs.
That's a great point. Leo, both Lesotho and Senegal have become popular destinations for digital nomads. In Lesotho, the government has launched initiatives to attract foreign investors and entrepreneurs, including digital nomads. Meanwhile, Senegal has established itself as a hub for startups and innovation, with a growing ecosystem of co-working spaces and incubators.
And I'm sure our listeners would agree that the co-working spaces in Dakar are some of the most vibrant and lively in Africa. But, Mira, what about the challenges facing digital nomads in these countries? For instance, how do they navigate the complex visa requirements and residency rules?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Lesotho, the government has introduced a new visa regime that aims to attract foreign investors and entrepreneurs, including digital nomads. The process can be complex, and many nomads have reported difficulties in navigating the bureaucracy. In Senegal, the government has also implemented reforms to simplify the visa process, but challenges remain.
I see. Well, Mira, it's clear that both countries have made significant efforts to improve their digital infrastructure and attract foreign investment. But what about the impact of social media on these countries? For instance, how do social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter shape public discourse and online engagement?
That's a fascinating topic. Leo, in Lesotho, social media has become an important platform for civic engagement and public discourse. Many citizens use social media to express their opinions on current events and to mobilize around social causes. In Senegal, social media has also played a significant role in shaping public discourse, particularly during the 2019 presidential election.
Ah, I remember that election. It was a fascinating example of how social media can shape public discourse and mobilize citizens around social causes. But, Mira, what about the challenges facing social media in these countries? For instance, how do governments and citizens navigate the complex issues of online censorship and freedom of expression?
That's a great question. Leo, in Lesotho, the government has been criticized for its handling of online censorship and freedom of expression. Many citizens have reported difficulties in accessing certain websites and online content, particularly those critical of the government. In Senegal, the government has also faced criticism for its handling of online censorship, but the country has a relatively strong tradition of freedom of expression.
I see. Well, Mira, it's clear that both countries have made significant efforts to improve their digital infrastructure and promote digital inclusion. But what about the future of digital development in these countries? For instance, how will they adapt to the rapidly changing landscape of digital technology and innovation?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Lesotho, the government has launched initiatives to promote digital literacy and innovation, including programs to develop digital skills and promote entrepreneurship. In Senegal, the government has also invested in digital infrastructure development, including the establishment of a national digital strategy to promote digital inclusion and innovation.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that the future of digital development in these countries is bright. But, Mira, what about the role of innovation hubs and co-working spaces in promoting digital development? For instance, how do these spaces foster innovation and entrepreneurship?
That's a great question. Leo, in Lesotho, the government has established innovation hubs and co-working spaces to promote digital entrepreneurship and innovation. These spaces provide a platform for entrepreneurs and startups to access resources, networks, and funding to grow their businesses. In Senegal, the government has also established innovation hubs and co-working spaces, including the prestigious Senegal Digital Hub.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that the Senegal Digital Hub is one of the most vibrant and innovative co-working spaces in West Africa. But, Mira, what about the challenges facing innovation hubs and co-working spaces in these countries? For instance, how do they navigate the complex issues of funding and resource mobilization?
That's a great question. Leo, in Lesotho, innovation hubs and co-working spaces face significant challenges in accessing funding and resources. Many entrepreneurs and startups have reported difficulties in accessing funding and support to grow their businesses. In Senegal, the government has launched initiatives to support innovation hubs and co-working spaces, including programs to provide funding and resources to entrepreneurs and startups.
I see. Well, Mira, it's clear that both countries have made significant efforts to improve their digital infrastructure and promote digital inclusion. But what about the role of digital literacy in promoting digital development? For instance, how can digital literacy programs help to bridge the digital divide and promote digital inclusion?
That's a great question. Leo, in Lesotho, the government has launched digital literacy programs to promote digital inclusion and bridge the digital divide. These programs provide training and resources to citizens to develop digital skills and access digital technologies. In Senegal, the government has also launched digital literacy programs, including initiatives to promote digital literacy among women and youth.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that digital literacy is essential for promoting digital inclusion and bridging the digital divide. But, Mira, what about the impact of digital literacy on economic development? For instance, how can digital literacy programs help to promote economic growth and development?
That's a great question. In Lesotho, digital literacy programs have been shown to have a significant impact on economic development. Many entrepreneurs and startups have reported that digital literacy has helped them to access new markets, customers, and funding to grow their businesses. In Senegal, digital literacy programs have also been shown to have a positive impact on economic development, particularly in the areas of entrepreneurship and innovation.
Huh, I see. Well, Mira, it's clear that both countries have made significant efforts to improve their digital.
I'm always to dive into the world of shopping and explore the best deals in Lesotho and Senegal. Both countries have a unique retail scene that's worth discovering.
Ah, shopping adventures. I'm right there with you. Mira, Lesotho's markets are a treasure trove of handmade crafts and local goods, while Senegal's bustling streets offer a mix of high-end and affordable shopping options.
That's so true. Leah, in Lesotho, you can find beautiful handmade blankets and hats, often made from local wool. And in Senegal, the markets are filled with colorful textiles, vibrant patterns, and unique souvenirs.
I love how both countries celebrate their cultural heritage through their crafts. But let's talk about the price-performance balance. Lesotho's local goods are often very affordable, but the quality can vary. In Senegal, you might find higher-end brands, but the prices can be steeper.
Exactly. And that's what makes shopping in both countries so exciting. You have to be willing to dig through the markets and negotiate prices to find the best deals. But when you do, the satisfaction is worth it.
I completely agree. And I think our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that the thrill of the hunt is all part of the fun. You never know what hidden gems you might find.
So, let's talk about the malls in both countries. In Lesotho, the malls are relatively small, but they offer a range of internal brands and local stores. In Senegal, the malls are more extensive, with a mix of high-end and affordable shopping options.
Ah, yes. The malls in Senegal are definitely a highlight. And I think it's interesting to see how both countries balance the need for luxury brands with the demand for affordable shopping options.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would love to know more about the shopping experiences in both countries. So, let's hear from you. If you shopped in Lesotho or Senegal, what were your favorite finds and what tips do you have for our listeners?
Great question, Mira. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the price-performance balance in both countries. Do you think it's worth splurging on higher-end brands? Or do you prefer to stick with local goods?
I think it's all about finding that balance. You want to get the best value for your money, but you also want to support local businesses and artisans. And let's be honest, it's always fun to splurge every now and then.
Fair enough, Mira. And I think our listeners would agree with you on that. But what about the shopping etiquette in both countries? Are there any cultural norms or customs that our listeners should be aware of?
Great question. Leah, in Lesotho, it's customary to haggle over prices, especially in the markets. And in Senegal, it's considered polite to greet shopkeepers with a friendly bonjour or salute.
Ah, yes. The art of haggling. It's all part of the fun, isn't it? And I think our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to navigate the markets and malls in both countries.
So, let's talk about the shopping districts in both countries. In Lesotho, the main shopping district is in the capital city, Nassau. And in Senegal, the shopping districts are located in the cities of Dakar and St. Louis.
Yes. And I think it's interesting to see how both countries have developed their shopping districts to cater to local and international tastes.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would love to know more about the shopping experiences in both countries. So, let's hear from you. If you shopped in Lesotho or Senegal, what were your favorite finds and what tips do you have for our listeners?
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. But before we go, let's summarize what we discussed. We've talked about the shopping opportunities and price-performance balance in Lesotho and Senegal. Explored the retail diversity from bustling markets to sprawling malls, and highlighted the unique shopping scenes in both countries.
And I think our listeners would agree with me that shopping in both countries is a true adventure. from the colorful markets to the high-end malls. There's something for everyone.
Well, I think that's a wrap for today. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting topics and discussions.
And if you have any comments or suggestions, please let us know in the comments section below. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, everyone. Let's talk about Lesotho and Senegal. Two countries that are definitely not getting enough love when it comes to cultural events and festivals. I mean, who needs Ibiza when you have the Lesotho Arts and Culture Festival?
That's a bold statement, Mira. But seriously, Lesotho has some amazing cultural events. Have you ever been to the Lesotho Highland Craft Festival? It's a celebration of traditional crafts and music.
Actually, I haven't been to that one, but I've heard it's incredible. And I'm sure our listeners living in Lesotho would agree with me that the festival is a must-see event. But let's talk about Senegal for a moment. I've been to the Dakar's festival, and it's an amazing experience. The energy is electric, and the music is just incredible.
I've heard great things about the Dakar's festival. And speaking of Senegal, have you ever tried to navigate the streets of Dakar during the festival? It's like a never-ending party.
That sounds like a real challenge. But I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the concept of festival fever in these two countries. Do you think it's a cultural phenomenon that brings people together?
Absolutely. I think it's a huge part of the cultural identity of both Lesotho and Senegal. And it's not just about the music and dance. It's about the community and the sense of belonging that comes with attending these festivals.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that these festivals are often a celebration of the country's rich cultural heritage. Like, have you ever tried to make a traditional bustling hat? It's a real challenge, but the end result is worth it.
I'm not sure I'd be the best person to try making a traditional bustling hat, but I'm sure it's a great way to learn about the culture. And speaking of culture, I've been reading about the Senegalese tradition of Teranga, which is all about hospitality and welcoming strangers.
That's fascinating. And I think it's a great example of how the cultural traditions of these countries are not just about music and dance, but also about community and values. But let's talk about something a bit more lighthearted. Have you ever tried to haggle at a market in Lesotho or Senegal? It's a real challenge, but it's also a lot of fun.
I have tried to haggle at a market in Senegal, and let me tell you, it's an art form. But I think our listeners would love to hear more about the cultural differences between Lesotho and Senegal. For example, in Lesotho, the traditional clothing is often more subdued, while in Senegal, it's all about bright colors and patterns.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that these cultural differences are not just about aesthetics, but also about the values and traditions that underlie them. Like, in Lesotho, the traditional clothing is often a symbol of respect and dignity, while in Senegal, it's a way to express oneself and showcase one's creativity.
I see what you mean. And speaking of creativity, I've been reading about the Lesotho Arts and Culture Festival, which is all about showcasing the country's rich cultural heritage through music, dance, and visual arts.
That sounds amazing. And I think it's a great example of how the cultural traditions of these countries are not just about preserving the past, but also about innovating and pushing the boundaries of what is possible.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that these festivals and cultural events are not just about entertaining the locals, but also about attracting tourists and promoting cultural exchange.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that these cultural events are not just about the countries themselves, but also about the people who attend them. Like, have you ever been to a festival in Lesotho or Senegal and felt like you're part of something bigger than yourself?
Yes, I have felt that way. And it's an incredible feeling. And I think it's also worth noting that these festivals and cultural events are not just about the present, but also about the future. Like, what kind of cultural traditions will these countries pass down to their children and grandchildren?
That's a great point. And I think it's also worth noting that these cultural traditions are not just about the countries themselves, but also about the global community. Like, How can we learn from and appreciate the cultural traditions of other countries? And how can we promote cultural exchange and understanding?
I think that's a great way to end this discussion. And I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us on this journey through the cultural events and festivals of Lesotho and Senegal. These insights could have been possible without Jet Off by referring to cultural trends, but we're glad we could share them with you.
Dive into the opportunities and ease of learning the local language in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious. Leo, have you had any experiences with language learning in these countries?
Actually, Mira, I've had a few friends who've studied in Lesotho, and they say it's a great place to learn Sesotho, the local language. They mention that the language schools are well organized and offer a range of courses for different levels.
That's fascinating. I heard that Lesotho has a strong focus on language education, and many schools offer language classes for both locals and expats. I'm sure our listeners living in Lesotho would agree with me that learning Sesotho is a great way to connect with the community.
Absolutely. Mira, and in Senegal, I've heard that Wolof is a widely spoken language, but French is also widely used, especially in urban areas. My friend who's lived in Dakar told me that it's relatively easy to learn Wolof, but it does take some practice to get the pronunciation right.
Yes. I can imagine that would be challenging. But I'm sure it's worth the effort to learn Wolof to connect with the local culture. And speaking of culture, I've heard that Senegal has a rich tradition of storytelling and oral language, which is really fascinating.
That's true, Mira. And in Lesotho, I've heard that the local language is also deeply connected to the country's history and culture. In fact, Sesotho is the official language of Lesotho, and it's widely spoken in schools, government, and everyday life.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I'm curious, have you ever tried to learn any local languages during your travels?
Well, Mira, I've tried to learn a few phrases here and there, but I'm afraid I'm not very good at it. I mean, I can say hello and thank you in Sesotho, but that's about it.
That's okay. Leo, I'm sure it's not easy to learn a new language, especially when you're traveling. But I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about your experiences with language learning.
Actually, Mira, I think it's more challenging to learn a language when you're not living in the country. I mean, when you're immersed in the language and culture, it's much easier to pick up.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think it's also important to remember that language learning is a process, and it takes time and practice to become proficient. But with the right resources and support, I'm sure anyone can learn a new language.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that learning a local language can open up new opportunities and connections with the local community. For example, in Lesotho, learning Sesotho can help you connect with the local people and understand their culture and traditions.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that learning a new language is a great way to challenge yourself and expand your horizons.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you have any tips or advice for learning a new language? Especially in a country like Lesotho or Senegal?
Oh, great question. Leo, I think one of the best ways to learn a new language is to immerse yourself in the culture and language. For example, you could try living with a host family or taking language classes from a native speaker.
That's a great idea, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that technology can be a great resource for language learning. For example, you can use language learning apps or watch TV shows and movies in the local language with subtitles.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that language learning is not just about grammar and vocabulary, but also about understanding the culture and customs of the country.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that learning a local language can be a great way to connect with the local community and build relationships.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that learning a new language is a rewarding experience that connects connections.
Well, Mira, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about language learning in Lesotho and Senegal.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that language learning is a lifelong process, and there's always more to learn and discover.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that learning a local language can be a great way to preserve the local culture and traditions.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that language learning is an important part of cultural exchange and understanding.
Well, Mira, I think we've reached the end of our conversation on language learning in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about this topic in future episodes.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that language learning is a journey, and it's never too late to start learning a new language.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that learning a local language can be a great way to show respect for the local culture and traditions.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that language learning is a valuable skill that can open up new opportunities and connections.
Well, Mira, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about language learning in Lesotho and Senegal.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that language learning is a lifelong process, and there's always more to learn and discover.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that learning a local language can be a great way to preserve the local culture and traditions.
That's a great point, Theo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that language learning is an important part of cultural exchange and understanding.
Well, Mira, I think we've reached the end of our conversation on language learning in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about this topic in future episodes.
Absolutely, Leah. And I think it's also worth noting that language learning is a journey, and it's never too late to start learning a new language.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that learning a local language can be
When it comes to safety and comfort for women travelers, some countries are really stepping up their game. Take Lesotho, for example. They've made significant strides in addressing harassment and promoting women's rights.
Lesotho, the mountain kingdom. I've heard great things about its natural beauty. But I'm curious, what specific initiatives have they implemented to ensure women's safety?
Well, they've established a special task force to tackle human trafficking and domestic violence. And they've also introduced laws that make it easier for women to report harassment and abuse.
That's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to have a strong support system in place. But what about cultural attitudes? How do the locals view women's safety and empowerment?
Actually, Lesotho has a strong tradition of female leaders and warriors. They've got a queen, Mosenet Moha Tisiayeso, who's a powerful figure in the community. And they also have a saying, Kehaso, Tula, Ayamela, which means peace, reign, and love. It's all about promoting harmony and respect.
Wow, that's fascinating. I can see why you'd want to visit Lesotho. But what about Senegal? How does it compare in terms of safety and comfort for women travelers?
Senegal is another great example. They've got a strong focus on women's empowerment and education. In fact, they've got a program called Femmes et Développement that aims to support women in entrepreneurship and leadership.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. But what about the cultural attitudes towards women's safety? Are they similar to Lesotho's?
Actually, Senegal has a more conservative approach to women's rights. But they're also working to address issues like FGM and domestic violence. And they've got a strong tradition of female artists and musicians, like Yuso and Noah's wife, and Alpha too.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate learning more about the local culture. But what about personal experiences? Have you or any of your friends had any encounters with women in Lesotho or Senegal?
Actually, I've heard from some friends who visited Lesotho and had really positive experiences. They said the locals were incredibly friendly and welcoming. But I've also heard that Senegal can be a bit more challenging for women travelers, especially at night.
I see. Well, it's always good to be aware of the potential challenges. But what about the law enforcement? How effective are they in addressing harassment and abuse?
That's a great question. In Lesotho, they've got a relatively strong police force. But in Senegal, they've got a more complex system. But both countries are working to improve their response to women's safety issues.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate hearing more about the local law enforcement. But what about community initiatives? Are there any organizations or initiatives that are working to promote women's safety and empowerment?
Actually, there are some amazing organizations in both countries that are working on this issue. In Lesotho, there's the Lesotho Women's Coalition, which is working to address domestic violence and FGM. And in Senegal, there's the Senegalese Women's Union, which is promoting women's rights and education.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these organizations. But what about our listeners' experiences? Have any of you had any encounters with women in Lesotho or Senegal?
Actually, I'm curious. Have any of you had any positive or negative experiences with women in these countries? Please share your stories in the comments below.
That's a great idea. Nira, I'm sure our listeners would love to share their experiences. And finally, what advice would you give to women travelers who are planning to visit Lesotho or Senegal?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, be respectful of the local culture and customs, and always prioritize your safety. And don't be afraid to ask for help or advice from the locals. They're often incredibly welcoming and willing to assist.
That's great advice. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate it. And finally, what's the best way for our listeners to stay informed about women's safety and empowerment in Lesotho and Senegal?
That's a great question. I would say, follow local news and social media, and stay up to date with the latest developments on women's rights and empowerment in these countries.
That's a great tip. Mira. And finally, what's the best way for our listeners to get involved and support women's safety and empowerment in Lesotho and Senegal?
That's a great question. I would say, consider volunteering or donations that are working on this issue. And also, spread the word and raise awareness about the importance of women's safety and empowerment in these countries.
That's a great idea. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would love to get involved and make a difference.
Dive into the fascinating world of Lesotho's legal system. It's a constitutional monarchy, with the Prime Minister serving as the head of government. What's interesting is that it has a dual system, with both customary law and common law coexisting.
Yes. And Senegal, being a secular republic, has a more straightforward system, with a president serving as the head of state and government. But what's really cool is that it has a unique approach to customary law, which is recognized as a vital part of its legal framework.
I love that. In Lesotho, customary law is deeply rooted in the culture and traditions of the Basotho people. It's fascinating to see how it's integrated into the modern legal system. And, of course, it's essential to acknowledge the impact of colonialism on the legal system in both countries.
Absolutely. Senegal, for instance, has a rich history of colonialism, and its legal system reflects that. But what's remarkable is how it has managed to adapt and evolve, incorporating both African and French influences.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm curious, what do you think about the role of customary law in Lesotho? Do you think it's a positive development, or is it a challenge for the country's modernization efforts?
Well, Mira, I think it's a bit of both. On one hand, customary law provides a sense of continuity and connection to the country's heritage. On the other hand, it can sometimes conflict with the more formal, modernized legal system. But overall, I think it's a valuable part of Lesotho's identity.
I agree, and I'm certain that our listeners living in Lesotho would agree with me. But let's talk more about Senegal. How does its legal system compare to Lesotho's in terms of individual rights and freedoms?
That's a great question. Senegal has a strong tradition of protecting individual rights and freedoms, with a focus on human rights and social justice. In fact, it was one of the first African countries to adopt the African Charter on Human and People's Rights.
Well, that's impressive. And I'm curious, what do you think about the relationship between individual rights and customary law in both countries? Do you think it's possible for customary law to coexist with modern individual rights?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's definitely possible, but it requires a delicate balance between tradition and modernization. In both countries, there's a need to adapt customary law to modern standards while still respecting the cultural heritage of the people.
I see what you mean, and I think that's a great point. Now, let's talk about landmark cases in both countries. What are some notable examples of how the legal system has protected individual rights and freedoms?
Well, in Senegal, there was a significant case involving a woman who was denied the right to inherit land based on customary law. The court ultimately ruled in her favor, recognizing her individual rights and challenging the traditional norms.
Wow, that's a great example. And I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of international law on the legal systems of both countries? Do you think it's had a positive or negative effect?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's had a positive effect, particularly in the area of human rights. International law has helped to raise awareness and promote the protection of individual rights and freedoms in both countries.
I agree, and I think that's a great point. Now, let's talk about the role of the media in both countries. How do you think the media has influenced the legal system and individual rights and freedoms?
Well, in Senegal, the media has played a significant role in promoting transparency and accountability in the government and the legal system. There have been several high-profile cases of journalists being harassed or imprisoned for their reporting.
Well, that's concerning. And I'm curious, what do you think about the impact of social media on the legal system and individual rights and freedoms in both countries?
That's a great question. Mira, I think social media has had a significant impact, particularly in the area of awareness and mobilization. It's helped to raise awareness about human rights issues and mobilize public support for individual rights and freedoms.
I agree, and I think that's a great point. Now, let's talk about the challenges facing both countries in terms of individual rights and freedoms. What do you think are some of the main challenges?
Well, in both countries, there are challenges related to corruption, human rights abuses, and the protection of individual freedoms. But I think one of the biggest challenges is the need to balance traditional norms with modern individual rights.
I see what you mean, and I think that's a great point. Well, that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you have any thoughts or comments, please let us know in the comments section.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on the legal systems of Lesotho and Senegal.
I'm telling you, Leo, Lesotho's spas are the epitome of tranquility. Have you ever had a chance to visit one of their famous hot springs?
Yes, I have. The hot springs at Lesotho's Katsi Dam are breathtaking. The water is crystal clear, and the scenery is simply stunning. But let's not forget about Senegal's thermal baths. Mira, they're a great way to relax and rejuvenate.
Oh, absolutely. Senegal's thermal baths are a hidden gem. I've heard they're perfect for relieving stress and muscle tension. But have you ever tried a traditional Lesotho massage? I've heard it's a real treat.
Actually, I have. The Bustling people are known for their exceptional massage techniques. It's a combination of pressure points and gentle strokes that will leave you feeling like new. But I have to say, Senegal's emphasis on natural remedies is quite impressive. They use everything from herbs to essential oils to promote wellness.
That's so true. Senegal's natural remedies are a great way to promote holistic wellness. And I've heard that Lesotho's traditional healers are also quite skilled in using natural remedies. Perhaps we can discuss the differences between the two countries' approaches to traditional medicine.
What a great idea. Mia, I'm curious to hear more about Lesotho's traditional healers. And while we're on the topic of traditional medicine, have you ever tried any of Senegal's traditional dishes that are said to have healing properties?
I have. Senegal's peanut stew is a favorite of mine, and it's said to have anti-inflammatory properties. But I've also heard that Lesotho's traditional dish, moro, is a great way to promote digestion and overall wellness.
Wow, I didn't know that. Moroho is definitely a dish I'd like to try. And speaking of trying new things, have you ever taken part in a traditional Lesotho ceremony? Mira, I've heard they're a great way to experience the culture and promote relaxation.
Oh, yes, I have. The Basolia people's traditional ceremonies are truly beautiful. And I've heard that Senegal's traditional ceremonies, such as the Aruba ceremony, are also a great way to promote cultural exchange and understanding.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, cultural exchange is so important, and I'm glad we're highlighting the unique aspects of each country's culture. And speaking of unique aspects, have you ever tried any of Lesotho's traditional music or dance? Mira?
Actually, I have. Lesotho's traditional music and dance are a great way to experience the culture and promote relaxation. And I've heard that Senegal's traditional music and dance, such as the sabar drumming, are also a great way to promote cultural exchange and understanding.
Ah, what a great connection to make. Mira, the sabar drumming is indeed a unique and powerful way to experience Senegalese culture. And speaking of powerful experiences, have you ever tried any of Senegal's traditional yoga or meditation practices? Mira?
Huh, actually, I have. Senegal's traditional yoga and meditation practices are a great way to promote relaxation and overall wellness. And I've heard that Lesotho's traditional yoga and meditation practices, such as the Basolia people's traditional yoga, are also a great way to promote holistic wellness.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, the Basodio people's traditional yoga is indeed a unique and powerful way to experience Lesotho's culture. And speaking of unique experiences, have you ever tried any of Lesotho's traditional spot treatments, such as the Basodio people's traditional hot stone massage?
Oh, yes, I have. The Basolia people's traditional hot stone massage is a great way to promote relaxation and overall wellness. And I've heard that Senegal's traditional spot treatments, such as the Yoruba ceremony spot treatment, are also a great way to promote cultural exchange and understanding.
Ah, what a great connection to make. Mira, the Aruba ceremony spot treatment is indeed a unique and powerful way to experience Senegalese culture. And speaking of powerful experiences, have you ever tried any of Lesotho's traditional healing rituals? Mira?
I have. Lesotho's traditional healing rituals are a great way to promote holistic wellness and cultural exchange. And I've heard that Senegal's traditional healing rituals, such as the Yoruba ceremony's healing ritual, are also a great way to promote cultural understanding and exchange.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, the Aruba ceremony's healing ritual is indeed a unique and powerful way to experience Senegalese culture. And speaking of unique experiences, have you ever tried any of Senegal's traditional herbal remedies? Mira?
Oh, yes, I have. Senegal's traditional herbal remedies are a great way to promote holistic wellness and cultural exchange. And I've heard that Lesotho's traditional herbal remedies, such as the Basolia people's traditional herbal remedies, are also a great way to promote cultural understanding and exchange.
Ah, what a great connection to make. Mira, the Basodio people's traditional herbal remedies are indeed a unique and powerful way to experience Lesotho's culture. And speaking of unique experiences, have you ever tried any of Lesotho's traditional spiritual practices? Mira?
Actually, I have. Lesotho's traditional spiritual practices are a great way to promote holistic wellness and cultural exchange. And I've heard that Senegal's traditional spiritual practices, such as the Yoruba ceremonies, spiritual practice, are also a great way to promote cultural understanding and exchange.
Ah, what a great point. Mira, the Yoruba ceremony's spiritual practice is indeed a unique and powerful way to experience Senegalese culture. And speaking of powerful experiences, Have you ever tried any of Senegal's traditional relaxation techniques? Mira?
Oh, yes, I have. Senegal's traditional relaxation techniques are a great way to promote holistic wellness and cultural exchange. And I've heard that Lesotho's traditional relaxation techniques, such as the Bustling people's traditional deep breathing exercises, are also a great way to promote cultural understanding and exchange.
Ah, what a great connection to make. Mira, the Baso people's traditional deep breathing exercises are indeed a unique and powerful way to experience Lesotho's culture. And, speaking of unique experiences, have you ever tried any of Lesotho's traditional yoga and meditation practices? Mira?
Actually, I have. Lesotho's traditional yoga and meditation practices are a great way to promote holistic wellness and cultural exchange. And I'm curious about how Lesotho approaches spirituality. It's a country with a rich cultural heritage, but I've also heard it's relatively small and rural. How do you think that impacts their approach to faith and spirituality?
Ah, great question. Yeah, from what I've gathered, Lesotho has a strong tradition of Christianity, particularly among the Baso people. But what's interesting is that they also have a unique blend of indigenous and Christian practices. It's almost as if they're taking the best of both worlds and creating something entirely new.
That's fascinating. I've heard that the Baso people have a deep connection to the natural world and the spirits that inhabit it. Do you think this connection to nature is a key part of their spiritual practice?
Absolutely. In Lesotho, you'll find a strong emphasis on ancestor worship and reverence for the land. It's not uncommon to see people offering prayers and sacrifices to the spirits of their ancestors, which is a beautiful way of honoring their heritage.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Senegal would agree with me that this approach to spirituality is quite unique and refreshing. It's not often that you see a culture that values both the natural world and the spiritual realm.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Lesotho is a country that defies categorization. But, in all seriousness, their approach to spirituality is a testament to the diversity and richness of human experience.
Moving on to Senegal, I've heard that they have a strong tradition of Islamic practice, particularly in the north of the country. How do you think this affects their approach to spirituality and faith?
Ah, yes. Senegal is a country with a long history of Islamic influence, and it's had a profound impact on their culture and spirituality. But what's interesting is that Senegal is also a country that values tolerance and coexistence. You'll find people of different faiths living and working together in harmony, which is a truly remarkable thing.
That's so true. I've heard that the Senegalese people are known for their warm hospitality and welcoming nature. Do you think this is related to their approach to spirituality and faith?
I think it's no coincidence that Senegal is a country that values hospitality and community. When you're a Muslim, you're taught to be kind and compassionate to others. And that's exactly what you see in the Senegalese people. They're some of the kindest and most welcoming people you ever meet.
I'm actually curious about what our listening about this. Do you think that a country's approach to spirituality and faith is related to their overall culture and values?
Well, I think it's safe to say that there's a strong correlation between a country's approach to spirituality and their overall culture and values. But it's also worth noting that every country is unique, and Senegal is no exception.
That's so true. I think what's most interesting about Lesotho and Senegal is the way they've each developed their own unique approach to spirituality and faith. It's not about one being better than the other, but rather about celebrating the diversity of human experience.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this conversation so valuable. By exploring the unique approaches to spirituality and faith in different countries, we can gain a deeper understanding of what it means to be human.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this journey, Leo, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have.
The pleasure is mine. Mira. And to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation and will continue to explore the rich diversity of human experience.
Dive into social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Lesotho and Senegal. Both countries have unique cultural landscapes. But what's the common thread here? I think it's how they've woven together different ethnic groups, languages, and traditions.
Ah, that's a great point. Mira, Lesotho's got a mix of Sotho and Nuni cultures, while Senegal's got Wolof, SER, and Dai influences. But, you know, it's not just about the numbers. It's about how they're integrated into society.
Exactly. And I think that's where social media comes in. In Lesotho, social media has become a platform for marginalized voices to be heard. They're using it to share their stories, raise awareness about social issues, and even mobilize communities to take action.
That's really interesting. Mira, and in Senegal, social media is also playing a big role in promoting cultural diversity. They've got platforms like YouTube and Instagram where people can share their music, dance, and art with a global audience.
I'm curious. Leo, have you noticed any differences in how social media is used in these two countries? Maybe something that's unique to one of them.
Actually, Mira, I think one of the biggest differences is in Lesotho. They're using social media to address issues like poverty and inequality. They're using hashtags like Lesotho Unites and Poverty Reduction to raise awareness and mobilize support.
That's amazing. Leo, and I think it's great that they're using social media to amplify marginalized voices. But, you know, it's not just about the tech. It's about the people using it. And I think that's where grassroots efforts come in.
Absolutely. Mira, grassroots efforts are crucial in both countries. In Lesotho, they're working with local communities to develop programs that promote social cohesion and reduce inequality. And in Senegal, they're using community-based initiatives to promote cultural diversity and social inclusion.
I love that. Leo, and I think it's great that they're using a human-centered approach to address social issues. But, you know, it's not just about the approach. It's about the outcomes. And I think that's where inclusivity comes in.
That's a great point. Mira, inclusivity is key in both countries. They're working to create spaces where everyone feels welcome and valued, regardless of their background or identity.
I'm curious. Theo, how do you think we can promote inclusivity in our own communities? Maybe there's something we can learn from Lesotho and Senegal?
Well, Mira, I think one of the most important things we can do is listen to marginalized voices. We need to create spaces where people feel comfortable sharing their stories and experiences.
That's so true. Leo, and I think it's great that we're having this conversation. I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's great that we're highlighting the importance of social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Lesotho and Senegal. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
So, let's talk about cultural celebrations. In Lesotho, they've got the Moria Arts Festival, which celebrates the country's rich cultural heritage. And in Senegal, they've got the Dakar International Festival, which promotes African culture and diversity.
Those sound like amazing events. Mira, and I think it's great that they're celebrating their cultural diversity. But, you know, it's not just about the festivals. It's about the everyday experiences.
Exactly. Leo, and I think that's where community-based initiatives come in. In both countries, they're working to promote cultural diversity and social inclusion through everyday experiences.
I see what you mean. Mira, and I think it's great that they're using a holistic approach to address social issues. But, you know, it's not just about the approach. It's about the outcomes.
Oh, that's a great point. Leo, and I think it's great that we're highlighting the importance of social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Lesotho and Senegal. If you have any thoughts on this, please share them in the comments.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation. It's conversations like these that help us understand the complexities of social issues and how to address them.
So, let's wrap up by saying that social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity are essential in both Lesotho and Senegal. And I think it's great that they're using a combination of grassroots efforts and community-based initiatives to promote these values.
Ah, that's a great summary. Nira. And I think it's great that we're highlighting the importance of social equality and respect for minorities in these countries. If you think this is something we should continue to explore, please let us know in the comments.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation. It's conversations like these that help us understand the complexities of social issues and how to address them.
Well, Nira, I think that's all for now. Thanks for having this conversation with me about social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Lesotho and Senegal.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Leo. And I think it's great that we're highlighting the importance of these values in our conversation. So, let's dive into the world of taxation for long-term immigrants in Lesotho and Senegal. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the tax system in either of these countries?
Mira, I've had my fair share of encounters with tax authorities in both Lesotho and Senegal. But I must say, Lesotho's tax system is quite unique. It's based on a flat rate of 20% on all income, whereas Senegal has a more complex system with different rates for different types of income.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Lesotho's tax system is designed to be simple and easy to understand, which is a great benefit for long-term immigrants who may not be familiar with the local tax laws. But what about retirement plans? Do either of these countries have any notable pension schemes for expats?
Yes. Retirement plans are a crucial aspect of taxation for long-term immigrants. In Lesotho, the government offers a pension scheme for its citizens, but it's not specifically designed for expats. However, Senegal has a more comprehensive pension scheme for expats, which includes a mandatory contribution of 10% of the employee's salary.
Well, that's a great benefit for expats in Senegal. But what about social safety nets? Do either of these countries have any programs in place to support long-term immigrants in case of emergencies or financial difficulties?
Yes. Social safety nets are essential for long-term immigrants. In Lesotho, the government has a social safety net program called the Social Security Act, which provides financial assistance to citizens who are unable to work due to illness or disability. However, this program is not specifically designed for expats.
I see. And what about Senegal? Do they have any similar programs in place to support long-term immigrants?
Yes. Senegal has a social safety net program called the National Social Security Fund, which provides financial assistance to citizens who are unable to work due to illness or disability. However, this program is not specifically designed for expats, but it does provide some benefits to foreign workers who have made significant contributions to the country.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever encountered any difficulties when trying to access these social safety net programs in either of these countries?
Yes. I have encountered some difficulties. For example, in Lesotho, I had to navigate a complex bureaucracy to access the social safety net program. And in Senegal, I had to deal with some corrupt officials who were trying to extort money from me.
Wow, I'm sorry to hear that. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating bureaucracy and dealing with corrupt officials is not exactly the most pleasant experience.
Yes. Exactly. And it's even more challenging when you're a long-term immigrant trying to access these programs.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Lesotho or Senegal would agree with me that it's essential to have a good understanding of the local tax laws and social safety net programs before making the move.
Yes. Absolutely. And it's not just about understanding the laws, but also about having a good support system in place to help you navigate any challenges that may arise.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of support systems, I'm curious, have you ever used any online resources or forums to help you navigate the tax system and social safety net programs in either of these countries?
Yes. I have used online resources and forums to help me navigate the tax system and social safety net programs in both Lesotho and Senegal. And I must say, they have been incredibly helpful in providing me with valuable information and advice.
I'm glad to hear that, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any recommendations for online resources or forums that can help them navigate the tax system and social safety net programs in either of these countries.
Yes. I'd be happy to share some recommendations. But first, let me just check my notes real quick. Yes. Here are a few online resources and forums that I found to be helpful.
Well, thank you so much. Leo, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate these recommendations. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners a question if you're a long-term immigrant in Lesotho or Senegal. Have you had any experiences with the tax system or social safety net programs that you'd like to share with us?
Yes. I'm sure our listeners would love to share their experiences. And, who knows? Maybe we can even get some helpful tips from them to share with our listeners in the future.
Hey everyone, welcome back to our comparison podcast. Today, we're exploring the rate of meeting specific interests in Lesotho and Senegal, from niche hobby clubs to specialized events and community engagement. We're diving into the unique offerings for enthusiasts in each country.
That's right. Mira, both Lesotho and Senegal have a rich cultural heritage that fosters diverse interests. Let's start with Lesotho, where traditional bustling culture is alive and well. From horseback riding to traditional dance, there's no shortage of activities to engage with.
I'm curious, Leo, how do the Bossodio people typically express themselves through art and music? Are there any unique instruments or styles that are characteristic of the region?
Great question. Mira, the Bustling people are known for their vibrant traditional clothing, which is often adorned with intricate designs and patterns. Music and dance are also an integral part of their culture, with traditional instruments like the diplong and mokoro TLO being used to create lively rhythms.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have you ever come across any unique traditional instruments while traveling or researching? If so, please share your experiences in the comments below.
Moving on to Senegal. We have a thriving music scene that's influenced by both traditional and modern styles. From Mbalax to Afropop, there's a rich cultural heritage that's reflected in the country's music.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Senegal would agree with me that the music scene is indeed vibrant. But what about the visual arts? Are there any notable museums or galleries that showcase the work of local artists?
Yes. Mira, Senegal has a number of excellent museums and galleries that showcase the country's rich cultural heritage. The National Museum of Senegal, for example, has an impressive collection of traditional masks and artifacts.
That's fascinating. Leo, I've always been a fan of traditional masks and artifacts. Have you ever had the chance to visit any of these museums or galleries?
Actually, Mira, I have visited the National Museum of Senegal, and it was an incredible experience. The masks and artifacts on display were truly breathtaking.
I'm glad to hear that. Leo, it's always great to hear about people's personal experiences and connections to the places they visit. Now, let's talk about community engagement and how it relates to meeting specific interests.
Great topic. Mira, in both Lesotho and Senegal, community engagement is a vital part of daily life. From traditional festivals to community events, there's always something happening that brings people together.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think community engagement is more important in one country than the other? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.
Moving on to specialized events, we have a number of unique festivals and celebrations in both Lesotho and Senegal. From the Lesotho Independence Day celebrations to the Senegal International Film Festival, there's always something to look forward to.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that festivals and celebrations are a great way to bring people together and showcase cultural heritage. But what about niche hobby clubs? Are there any unique clubs or groups that cater to specific interests in either country?
Yes, Mira. Lesotho has a number of unique clubs and groups that cater to specific interests. From hiking clubs to cultural heritage clubs, there's always something for everyone.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have you ever come across any unique clubs or groups while traveling or researching? If so, please share your experiences in the comments below.
Well, Mira, that's all the time we have for today. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this comparison of Lesotho and Senegal's unique offerings for enthusiasts.
Thanks for joining us. Everyone, don't forget to follow the Jet Off AI YouTube channel for more episodes like this. Hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop and be among the first to listen.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments below. Reading and responding to them truly brightens our day.
Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with more. Until then, take care and see you in the next one. Warmest wishes from us.